Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. This is John Grieve in Governance Services. The meeting will begin shortly. If you've not done so already, could I remind you to activate your camera, but to also mute your microphone. I notice we're live. Chair, over to you.
Thank you, John. Yes, that was quick. And I was expecting you to give the word and go on the webcast, but somebody's beat us to it. Anyway, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this remote meeting of the City Plans Panel. My name is Councillor Jim McKenna, and I will be chairing today's meeting. City Plans Panel deals with applications from the city centre, as well as the biggest and largest, most significant applications the council receives. The aim of the panel is to hear all the relevant information from applicants, members of the public and council officers to help members of the panel make their decisions. I would like to start the meeting today by confirming that this meeting of the City Plans Panel meets the requirement of the council's constitution, even though members of the panel are in remote attendance. While today's items will be fully discussed as is usual, remote attendance require a few slight changes as to how I will manage the debate. Therefore, can all attendees mute their microphones unless I invite them to speak? This will avoid background disruptions. Can all participants keep their cameras on during the meeting? All participants will be invited to introduce themselves at the start of the public session to make it clear to public observers who will be involved in proceedings. I intend to systematically go around each panel member, asking them if they have any questions and comments to ensure everyone has the opportunity to participate. And I shall do the same when requesting your vote. Of course, that will not be necessary today. I ask for your assistance and patience while I go through the process. In order to avoid disruption to the meeting, should I lose internet connectivity, I propose that we appoint a vice chair who could step in during my absence. Can I therefore move Neil Walshaw to be that person and invite members to second the motion? I've seen that, yes. I'll allow a few seconds. Okay, I take that, that's been agreed. Could I now invite members and officers to introduce themselves and mute your microphone once you've introduced yourself? I'll start with, as usual, Councillor David Blackburn.
Sorry about that, we're having trouble unmuting myself. Councillor David Blackburn, Farnley and Wortley Ward.
Thank you, David. Councillor Peter Carlisle. Oh, Councillor Campbell, sorry.
Good afternoon, everyone. Councillor Colin Campbell here.
Councillor Peter Carlisle.
Good afternoon, Councillor Peter Carlisle, Carlin Farsley Ward.
Thank you. Councillor Dan Cohen.
Councillor Dan Cohen, Alwoodley Ward.
Thank you, Dan. Councillor Al Garthwaite.
Councillor Al Garthwaite, Headingley and Hyde Park Ward.
Thank you, Al. Councillor Caroline Groon has given her apologies. Councillor Peter Groon, has he given his apologies?
Yes, Chair.
Okay, moving on then. Councillor Khan, he's given his apologies, I believe.
That's right, Chair.
Can I invite Denise Reagan, the substitute, to come in, please?
Hello, Councillor Denise Reagan, substituting for Councillor Khan, representing Bermondsey and Richmond Hill Ward.
Thank you for agreeing to substitute, Denise. Councillor Graham Latty.
Good afternoon, Councillor Graham Latty from Guiseley and Rawdon.
Thank you. Councillor Elizabeth Nash.
Good afternoon, Elizabeth Nash, representing Hunslet and Riverside.
Thank you. Councillor Paul Wadsworth.
Good afternoon, Councillor Paul Wadsworth, representing Guiseley and Rawdon Ward.
Thank you, Paul. And finally, Councillor Neil Walshaw.
Hi, Chair. Hi, everybody. Councillor Neil Walshaw, Headingley and Hyde Park Ward.
I'm aware, John, that we have Kelly Brooks substituting, so maybe I'll bring Kelly in at this stage.
Hiya, Councillor Kelly Brooks, Little London and Woodhouse Ward, and I'm substituting for Councillor Caroline Groom today.
Okay. Do we have
Chair and
other...
also Councillor Sharon Hamilton.
Oh, okay. Sharon, please come in.
Councillor Sharon Hamilton, substituting for Councillor Peter Gruen from Moortown and Meanwood Ward.
Thank you, Sharon. Moving on to officers. David, can I start with you, Mr. Feeney?
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is David Feeney. I'm the Chief Planning Officer for Leeds. Thank you.
Thank you. Jonathan Carr.
Good afternoon, Jonathan Carr, Head of Development Management.
Daljit, please.
Afternoon, everyone. Daljit Singh, Group Manager.
Thank you, Daljit. Martin Elliott, please.
Afternoon, Chair. Martin Elliott, Head of Strategic Planning.
Good afternoon, Martin. Carol Cunningham.
Afternoon, Chair. Carol Cunningham, Principal Planning Officer.
Thank you, Carol. Richard Crowther.
Good afternoon, Chair. Richard Crowther, Team Leader, Environmental Advisory from Transport Strategy.
Thank you. Jenny Fisher. Okay, we'll come back if need be. Matt Hills. Matt, please.
Good afternoon, Chair. Matt Hills, Legal Advisor to this afternoon's meeting.
Thank you. Nikki Deal.
Good afternoon, Chair. Nikki Deal, Support Legal Advisor in the event that Mr Hills loses connection for this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikki. Gillian MacLeod.
She's not here, Chair.
Okay. Is there somebody substituting for Gillian?
Yeah.
Highways questions may well come up.
Yeah,
Andrew
hello, Chair.
Thickett, Chair.
Hello, Chair. It's Andrew Thickett, Highways and Transportation. I'm substituting for Gillian today.
Oh, thank you, Andrew. Pam Warburton.
Good afternoon, Pam Warburton, Services Team Manager.
Thank you, Pam, and you're the person who's put all this together, you and John, so thank you for that. Okay. John Greaves, please.
Afternoon, everyone. John Grieve, Governance Services, and I'll be clerking today's meeting.
Likewise, John, thank you for all your support and help in putting this together. No easy task. Thank you. Moving on to agenda item 1. Over to you, John, please.
Thank you, Chair. Under agenda item 1, there are no appeals against the refusal of inspection of documents. Under item 2, there are no items which require exclusion of the press or public. Under item 3, I am unaware of any late items of business. Under item 4, could I ask members to declare any disclosable pecuniary interests? I'll assume that's none. Under agenda item 5, apologies for absence. Apologies for absence from Councillor Caroline Gruen, Peter Gruen and Councillor Khan. And we've got Councillor Brooks, Hamilton and Reagan substituting today. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Moving on, can we go to agenda item 6, the minutes of the meeting held on the 3rd of September. And with your permission, I will do the usual and go through it page by page, starting with page 7 on my agenda. Moving on, page 8. David or John, if Peter Gruen was here, I'm sure he'd ask for an update on the top of the page regarding oversupply of accommodation. There's 3 issues there, isn't there? I understand the report will be coming to Development Plans Panel. Is there any update on that? And then there's the matter of the 106 agreement, which Councillor Gruen continually asks about. David?
Sorry, Chair, just unmuting. On the work with regard to students, colleagues in the strategic policy team are looking at that work, and we will be taking a paper back to development plan panel as planned. And on the Section 106 agreement, if this one relates to the sort of East Leeds issues, then we are making some good progress with that. I understand it's now been signed.
Oh, good. Thank you, David. I'm sure he would have asked me about it, so at least it keeps her on the agenda. Moving on to page 9. Page 10. And finally, page 11. Can we agree that they're a correct record? I'll take silence as affirmative. Thank you for that. Moving on to agenda item 8. Can I invite Carol Cunningham, please, to introduce this?
Thank you, Chair.
There's no time pressure. Sorry, I was about to say there's no time pressure with just one item, so take the time you need to explain this to us, please.
Okay, that's fine. Can I just point out that we've also got with us today Polly Cook, who is the Chief Officer for Sustainable Energy, if members have any questions of her. And then we've also got Eve Roodhouse, who is our Chief Officer from our Economic Development team. We've also got a representative from WSP, who is here as well, if you want to ask them some questions. So could I have the presentation, please, Pam? Thank you. Could I have slide number 2, please? So we're here today to discuss the application up at the airport. Since the panel report was written, we've received a further 35 letters of objection and a further 5 letters of support, which raise no additional issues from what are already included in the report in front of you. We have also received an economic report from Galba, which gives their assessment into the updated socio-economical environmental statement. This has only been recently received, so officers have not had opportunity to consider and report back on this. In terms of the application, as you can see, it's got a very long description, but it basically relates to 2 main matters. The first matter is a new terminal building and the associated works that go along with that, which I'll explain shortly, and also a change in the flight period, with the nighttime flight period being reduced. It currently runs from 11 o'clock at night till 7 o'clock in the morning, and this application is for it to run from 11:30 at night to 6 o'clock in the morning. Can I have slide 3, please? This is the red edge of the application site. I think we all know where the airport is. It's on the edge of the suburbs of Eden, up in the Greenbelt. To the north of the site is a SAP allocation for an employment hub. And the railway station, which may come along, is located to the southeast of the red edge, although it is actually off this map. You'll notice on here, as well as the red edge covering the actual terminal and the runway and everything, there is also an extension to the southeast corner. That includes one of the biodiversity areas that's being put forward as part of this planning application. And then the red edge that you can see to the northern part of the site on the outskirts of Guiseley is also the second biodiversity area that has been being put forward as part of the scheme. Can I have slide 4, please? This is an aerial showing you its relationship with the existing built-up area. If you have a look where it says Sentinel car park on that plan, just south of that is the current Viking car park. And this will be extended as part of the scheme for the relocated car parking spaces that are lost as part of the development. The potential railway station is to the southeast of the car parking area on the east side of the airport's apron. So if you look where it says Leeds Bradford Airport, to the south of that car parking area, if you go to the east, that is where the railway station, if it comes forward, would be located. And I'm sure you probably already all know that anyway. Can we move on to slide number 5, please? This is an aerial showing you closer up to Leeds Bradford Airport. So you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, that's the existing terminal building. We've probably all been to it. And that building at the moment will remain. And we will get a planning application in the future for its proposed new use, which at this stage we don't know. It will be used in the interim because the traffic control tower is in that building, which needs to remain there in the interim period. The new terminal building will be located on the right-hand side of this aerial. So if you can see where it says long stay car park on the slide there on the right-hand side, there's a square area of apron there. There's an aeroplane on it at the moment. That is where the new terminal building will be located. There is an existing fuel farm there, which you can probably see on that aerial, and that fuel farm will be relocated. What this aerial doesn't do, and we saw when we went on site back in January, it doesn't show you the difference in levels between that long stay car park and the apron. There's quite a significant bank there, if you can all remember from when we parked on that car park below and had a look up. If I could have slide 6 now, please. So this is showing you the site plan for the development. And as you can see, the new terminal building is on the right-hand side of the plan in front of you, and it's sort of coloured an olive green colour. And you'll also see on that this colour extends to the north of the existing apron, and that will be the new piers which will be connected to this new terminal building. I've got the floor plans and the elevations of those to show you in a minute. In front of the new terminal building, there will be a new bus station, and there will also be a new drop-off area. And all of the car parking around the area will be reconfigured. The fuel farm that I talked about that's on the existing apron will be relocated. If you look sort of on the edge of Yeadon, there are 3 buildings that you can see, 3 black buildings, which is to the south of the existing runway. That is where the new fuel farm will be located. If I could have slide 7, please. So I'm going to briefly go through the floor plans for the new building, just to give you a flavour of what the new terminal will look like. Now, the green arrows on these plans are people who are departing, and that's the journey that they will take when they come to the airport. And the red arrows are the people who have arrived at Leeds Bradford Airport and will be leaving. So this first side shows you the lower ground, and this part will be level with the actual entrance into the new terminal. And this will be a lobby area, and at the back of the lobby area, there will be lifts and escalators, which will take you up to the next level. Can I have the next level, please? So on this next level, you will see that the green area, this is the people who are departing. This is the main terminal hall with all the check-in desks. And behind this area is all the baggage screening and the loading that will then take the baggage onto the aeroplanes. The part for the arriving passengers on this level is the baggage reclaim area, and then they will go through customs in this part, and then they will also go into the arrival hall. Can I have the next slide, please? This is the next floor up, and this is basically related to arrivals only, and this will be the arrival area and immigration area. And then can I have the next slide, please, slide 10. This is the final floor. This is where the passengers who are departing from Leeds Bradford Airport will make their way into. This will have the passenger screening, and then it will have the lounge and the lounges and the food and the drinks and the shops for all the departing passengers. And it'll have nice views out either way over into the countryside and over onto the existing runway. Can I have slide 11, please? These are the piers. The piers are 2-storey. The ground floor of the proposed piers will have the departing passengers, and that's the route that they will take to get to the aeroplanes. And then if we have slide 12, that's the floor above, and this will be the route that the arrival passengers will take. So they will both come in and go in on different floors. And pardon me. Can I have the next slide, please? You've probably all seen these before. This is the elevations of the proposed new terminal building. And this one gives you the impression now of the ground level and the bank on which the new terminal building will be placed. You can see at the front, this front entrance lobby, that will be majority glazing and will have elements of bronze, champagne, coloured cladding. And then the actual main terminal building behind, the majority of this where the public will be fully glazed. And the elements of cladding in the bronze and champagne and light grey are back of house areas. Can I have slide 14, please? This is showing you the piers that we talked about, the 2-storey piers. And again, these will have glazing in so people can see either way over out to the countryside and onto the apron. And then it'll also have elements of cladding and glazing. I'm just going to show you a few visuals if I can have slide number 15, please. This is showing you a visual of the front elevation. The banking will be proposed to have a wildflower meadow on it. There will be the trees within the car parking areas, and you can see the difference here between what the cladding and what the glazing elements of the design are hoping to achieve. You can see immediately outside is one of the bus shelters, so the buses will come right almost to the front door of the terminal under the new arrangements. Can I have the next slide, please? This is showing you a view from behind and showing you the piers on the banking, the car parking areas and the rear of the proposed terminal building. Can I have the next slide, please? And this is showing you another one in its setting. You can see here the bus station to the front. In front of that bus station is the drop-off areas. And then the green building to the left is a new meet and greet building that will be provided. And then I think I've got one more slide for you to see. And that's just showing you from a further distance with all the car parking that will be surrounding. You've got the report in front of you, and as well as the report in front of you, you've also got the technical briefing that was given to members a few weeks ago to explain some of the more complicated aspects of the scheme. And I don't intend to go through all of that with you today. The main issues that you need to think about is that there's 10 sections to the position statement for you to think about today, and there's 9 questions that are to be asked of you. As background from a policy point of view, policy SP12 of the core strategy is relevant, which manages the growth of the airport while recognising that further growth has to satisfy a number of criteria. And these criteria relate to surface access improvements, environmental and local impacts, including visual and highway issues, with climate change being within the environmental considerations of this policy. The first question that you're going to be asked relates to highway and transport matters. Officers have been negotiating with the applicants on this matter to establish a surface access strategy, which will include funding for public transport to encourage passengers' employees to move towards public transport to the airport rather than the single use of car. This matter is still ongoing and so far has not been concluded. If there is sufficient shift from the use of the car park onto public transport, which we are hoping, then there will be no need to increase the car parking numbers, except to replace car parking lost from the redevelopment by an extension to the existing car park. If the conclusion comes that we do require additional car parking in this area, then there will be land available at the side of the Viking car park to accommodate this, and this provision can be controlled by a Section 106 agreement. The proposal also involves a reconfiguration of the highway network and the existing car parks, with the final designs of these still being discussed. The free one-hour car park will not form part of the revised car parking layout, with the applicant stating that its provision encourages people to travel to the airport in a car, which is not sustainable. The next question that you'll be asked about will relate to the impact of the proposal in terms of climate change. The new terminal building will be designed so that it is carbon neutral. As explained in paragraph 10.15 of the report, greenhouse gas emissions are categorised into 3 scopes, and these scopes are explained further in the technical note under paragraph 3.2. In terms of the application, members need to be aware that the domestic and international flights cannot be included in the carbon emissions. This is in line with government advice, and I refer you to the relevant policy documents related to this matter under paragraph 8.19 to 8.39 of the report. Emissions from domestic flights are relevant to the national carbon budget, whilst international flights are monitored through the UN's Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation. Taking that on board, this application will result in a contribution of greenhouse gases within the Leeds district increasing from its current 2.1% to 2.5%, with an overall increase of 0.4%. This increase is mainly due to the additional passengers that will be travelling to the airport. The applicants are hoping to provide further green travel measurements, which hopefully will reduce this percentage down even further. The third question you'll be asked relates to air quality, with the predictive increase in air movements as a result of this application having a negligible effect on air quality. The predicted increase in aircraft movements generated by the development will not be significant in terms of air quality, and this can be mitigated against by a green travel plan and the movement of the vehicle fleet to electric cars, buses, taxis, etc. The fourth question relates to noise. And under this section, there are 4 sources of noise that you need to consider. The first issue of noise is during construction. Because of its location away from residential properties, and because the construction works will tend to occur during the day, and because we're at an airport which already generates a considerable amount of noise, the noise generated during the construction will not consider to be detrimental, and it can be controlled by a number of conditions. The second one is ground-based operations. This relates to plant and machinery, as the location of the airport is located well away from residential properties to not cause an issue in terms of noise from plant and machinery. The fuel farm will be located closer to houses, and we have had additional information submitted about the noise that will be generated from the fuel farm, which at the moment is being assessed by officers. The third element of noise is road traffic noise, and we considered in this location that there will be no significant increases in noise created from the additional traffic going to the airport. The element of noise that you're probably most interested in is the element of noise created by the additional flights. The current limits on the airport in terms of flights relates back to the approval in 1993. There is no limit on daytime flights at the airport. The limit relates to the aircraft movements during the night, which is currently 11 o'clock at night till 7 o'clock in the morning. And as I've said previously, as part of this application, this will change to 11:30 to 6 o'clock. This means that the periods of 6 till 7 and 11 till 11:30 will be removed from control, and these controls relate to the number of flights and the quota count of these flights. The major change will be the number of flights that take place between 6 and 7, which will increase from 5 to 17 with the development, although these would also increase from 5 to 10 without the development due to the introduction of quieter aircraft. This is because the consent in 1993 did not restrict the number of flights with a quota count less than 0.5. And quite a lot of the current aeroplanes now can get in under the quota count of less than 0.5, which is why more can fly now than could do in 1993. The information has been submitted that the additional noise within this hour shouldn't have a detrimental impact due to the fact that there will be the introduction of quieter aircraft. The main impact of the aircraft will be they'll be able to operate overnight, which instead of having a limit on the quota count, it will come out of an annual quota budget. This will mean that there will be more airplanes flying overnight. And it will also mean that the noise potentially could get worse in the short term until quieter aircraft come on board in later years. The applicant intends for mitigation against this noise impact with financial help for residents who are within our noise envelope map. And the noise envelope map is shown on page 65 of your technical briefing report. The next issue is health. There are positive health benefits to the proposal, with the socio-economic benefits that the development will bring in terms of jobs, as well as a sustainable terminal building, which will improve health for the staff working there and the passengers using the terminal. This has to be weighed against the impact of the noise from the development on people's sleep patterns and the long-term health implications from this. There also could be increased inequalities due to the mitigation scheme. The next issue relates to design. The design of the new building is modern, simple and elegant, whilst also achieving BREEAM excellence as well as being zero carbon. It successfully uses extensive glazing to provide an inviting appearance as well as allowing activity into the building to be viewed while allowing views out. In terms of landscaping, there will be on-site landscaping around the building and around the proposed car parks, which will help to soften the development. And you can see that on some of the CGIs that you've seen today. There will be some tree loss caused by the development, but these are low in number and consist of lower category trees. And replacement for these trees will be provided. In terms of off-site planting, this can be accommodated in the biodiversity areas that I showed you on the map before, but there will be no landscaping shielding views from the east and northeast. But planting here is considered might only have a limiting effect anyway, and the views from this area already show a major development site of the airport, and in later years will also show the backdrop of the employment hub from this location. In terms of ecology and biodiversity, I've already told you that there's 2 areas of biodiversity are proposed, and these will allow for a minimum of a 10% biodiversity net gain to be achieved from this development. The way that the biodiversity can be implemented and maintained can be covered by conditions. We also have had a habitats regulation assessment that has been submitted as part of the application, but this is still being considered by officers. The final area that you need to think about are the economic benefits. The new terminal will create more jobs and more income for the Leeds region. The airport has regional importance and is the main driver for jobs and growth in the North West Leeds area. Without meaningful improvements and development of its facilities, the airport might struggle to grow, and the development of business which may have negative impacts for the employment in North West Leeds and the wider economic impact on the city. And that's all I have to say. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Carol. John, is there any speakers? Mr. Grieve?
Chair, I'm not aware of any speakers.
Okay, thank you. We can move on to questions. I am aware that we have Sorry, I am aware
Chair,
that.
Chair, if I can just come in. Yeah, because it's a position statement, the applicant does have a right to speak, so they are down to speak today. I think before there's questions to officers, we should invite the applicant.
Okay, that's fine. That was the question I was toying with at the moment, but thank you for that. Pam, can we take that visual off my screen, please? I can only see a limited amount of people. Thank you. Okay. So please, the applicants, please, however they want to deal with it, whoever wants to come in.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, and thank you all very much for this opportunity just to say a few words about the proposal. I know your time is short, so I won't be very long. I'd like to begin by thanking all those who've taken the time. Before I begin, I should point out, Chair, you did ask earlier on, I should point out my name's Hal Rees, and I'm the CEO of Chief Executive Officer of Leeds Bradford Airport. I'd like to begin by thanking all of those members of the public who've taken time to the contribution to the consultation, both for and against. I think the debate has been very balanced overall. As I say, I won't say very much except to highlight 3 key things that I think define this proposal. The first is modernisation. The existing terminal building, which I hope to demolish, and I'm very happy to commit to demolishing the building as soon as I can relocate the tower. The existing building was built in 1965, and as I'm sure anyone of you who's used the airport in recent years will know, is not really capable anymore of providing the levels of customer service that the modern world expects, for example, in relation to people with reduced mobility, and certainly in terms of sustainability. So we really need to modernise a building that was, 55 years old. The second key factor is sustainability, and I know we've worked extremely hard in 3 key areas to make this development, this proposal, as sustainable as possible. The first area, as Carol Cunningham described, is in terms of the airport and its operations, which will be net zero from 2023. And clearly those are carbon emissions that we can control very closely. The second area is in the surface access area, and we've made great efforts and to make sure the surface access strategy is as extensive and as generous as possible. And Carol Cunningham alluded to an outstanding issue, which we have a proposal in front of officers for at the moment, which I hope will result in lower carbon emissions from surface access by 2030 than the airport currently causes. So I hope that will be regarded as positive. And the third area is in relation to aircraft, and of course aircraft can't be counted, but I don't know whether any of you has seen recently some of the press releases from, for example, Velocis, which is a sustainable synthetic aviation fuel plant in Humberside that will be open and producing by 2023. And also yesterday at Cranfield, the world's first hydrogen-fueled electric-powered commercial aircraft flew for an hour. And I think both of those developments, augur very, very interesting future from a technological perspective. These new sustainable environmental technologies for aircraft propulsion are coming in, and some of them are available today. The third area, of course, is socio-economic development. And of course, it's a £150 million investment there or thereabouts, with both short-term jobs in construction and, of course, much longer-term, higher paid, higher value jobs as the airport develops. So to summarize, if I may, I think this project is all about modernizing LBA in a sustainable way so that it can play its part in the socio-economic development, not only of Leeds City, but the wider region. And I'll stop there really just to say thank you again for your time and to thank the committee for its consideration. Thank you.
Thank you, Hal, for that contribution. Sorry, I didn't introduce you, but it's not easy when I have all these.
No, it's quite all right. Thank you.
And it's a learning process for every one of us, I have to say. But thank you, though. Comments welcome. Can I move on then to members who may have questions? Starting, we usually go the other way around, don't we? We usually go to the bottom of the list. So we'll start with Councillor Walshaw.
Thanks, Chair. So, quite a few questions. I'm probably going to focus, at least initially, Chair, in and around the subject of climate change and climate emergency. A little perturbed, bordering on extremely concerned, that at the moment, advice to the council, legal advice to the council suggests we can't consider domestic and international flights emissions within our consideration of this application. Now, that would seem to be, I think, to most members of this panel, somewhat perverse. And members of this panel be aware there is enough legal opinion flying around that you could spread the legal papers out and walk from here to London without actually touching the M1 motorway. There's so much paperwork around. I think it's really important as a panel, we understand that, why this position is currently what it is, and why so much legal opinion differs from this. So I think just as a starter, Chair, I'd like to request we further legal work is done on this, for legal assessment is done on this, including up to and including independent further counsel's advice, because I think this, from my point of view, Chair, this question, these issues regarding domestic and international flight emissions go to the absolute heart of this application. So in terms of questions, when I've been looking at assessing the report, and I've drawn to a couple of points in starting off in the MPPF. So we've got paragraph sort of 148, and sort of paraphrasing, but it does say that shape places in ways that contribute to radical reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Now, the building can be as whizzy as we want, and I had the first admit it's a very fine building with very fine BREEAM standards. But that's not what this building's about. This building enables and handles domestic and international flights, and it's really rather difficult to look back that when you consider making of places. So I'd like to know why that's currently is not considered germane to the application. Moving on to, we got looking to paragraph 154 and section B. The question is, can the impacts be made acceptable? What does acceptable mean in this context? It might be an acceptable looking building, but it's enabling things that may well be unacceptable. So I'd like a view on that, please. And again, I'd like to put that forward for further legal consideration. I remember this is only a position statement, and this is an extremely useful time to have these conversations, Chair. I think you'll agree.
Indeed.
Looking at our own spatial policy 12, III, this always makes me chuckle. Needs to be an environmental assessment to mitigate adverse environmental impact where appropriate. Well, from my point of view, Chair, the adverse environmental impacts would very much centre on aviation emissions. irrespective of how the building does or doesn't perform. And as well as we can factor in, of course, we need to factor in surface access, which has been accepted by all parties. And if we're considering this under SP12, how does that factor in our international agreements? We've got a Paris Agreement, we've got our own Climate Change Act, we've got our own Declaration of Climate Emergency. How does that come in? I'd like some more information on that. Particularly looking at domestic flight emissions do come under the Paris Agreements. How does this not come under that as well? I'd like some clarity on that. And again, further legal opinion on that. And international emissions, that is, I admit, rather woolly at the moment with the ICAO scheme, which I don't think is particularly satisfactory and is certainly coming under review internationally. I think there's a lot of questions regarding how the flight emissions are factored in. And like I said, that goes to the heart. So I'd like some clarity on that. And then I've got a further set of questions to follow up after some information on that, if that's all right, Chair.
Okay, there are a lot of questions there, Neil, as you quite rightly say, and some of them I think will need some work by technicians and officers before we can get the full answers. But can I invite David to come in and ask the relevant person to answer some of those questions? Mr. Feeney?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your questions, Councillor Walsh. On the legal matters, we're going to ask our colleague Matthew Hills to pick up on those. On policy SP12, Martin Elliott can kick off on that, but other colleagues will be coming in as well. So if you could start with Matthew, please, Chair, if that's okay.
That's fine, David, thank you. Matthew.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Chair. Well, Councillor Walsh, we do already have a QC instructed actually to assist us with the progression of this application. So what's been put in the documentation before members so far is based on advice that's been given by him. So I wouldn't propose this afternoon to go behind his advice at this stage. But of course, you've given some helpful indication as to the areas that you would like to see expanded upon next time this matter comes back to panel. And so we'll certainly very happily take those matters back to our QC for his comments. My understanding at the moment in terms of the flight emissions and your question as to why we're not taking those into account is because the mitigation for domestic and international flights is being dealt with through other mechanisms. So international flights, for example, are being dealt with via the UN under a system acronymed CORSIA. And so that, as far as I understand, looks at flights across the world and seeks to mitigate the impact of international aviation to net zero. Similarly, with the domestic flights within the UK, that's something that central government are keen that we look at nationally rather than regionally. The logic of not counting those when we're looking at carbon emissions in relation to this airport expansion seems to me to lie in the fact that if you were to do that, you'd almost be double counting the mitigation for those flights. So if the UN, for example, are mitigating all the international flights that come out of Leeds Bradford, if we're then taking that into account as well, they're mitigated twice, which obviously in terms of the environment isn't a bad thing, but in terms of what we need to do to progress this application, it's not quite right to do. So I hope that helps for now. As I say, I wouldn't want to go behind the advice that we've already received from our QC, but hopefully I can offer you some reassurance that those points you've raised will be taken back to him. And the next time this comes before you for consideration, hopefully at least you should have some answers that you seek in relation to those points.
Yeah, thanks. That's helpful, Matt. And as you'll well be aware, there's quite a lot of there is differing legal opinion. We have got we have public policy broken into law and guidance, but it's all subject to interpretation. So I think for members of this panel, we need to get into real detail on this, because I think we can talk about legal positions and double counting all we want, but I think we need to be mindful at all times of the real world implications of the decisions we take, because clearly a doubling of flights is an extremely significant expansion in carbon emissions. I mean, if we look at our table, I think it's well over a net increase of 442,000 tonnes of CHCs a year for Leeds. So what I want to ask further then is, if this permission was granted and that was impacted onto Leeds, then how does that affect our reaching a carbon budget, a net zero of 2030? We haven't picked the net zero figure of 2030 out of thin air. That's based on hard real world science. And a climate emergency doesn't really mind whether we double, triple or single count anything. Science will happen, physics will happen, biology will happen, chemistry will happen. So I think what I'd like to know is, I think members of the panel need to be presented with information to be clear in our minds as how, if this expansion was to go ahead, how do we meet that real world obligation? And perhaps a question, perhaps for the applicant, is if you granted this permission and there's a increase in flights as you want to achieve, given that we still have that 2030 net zero obligation, what are the changes do you think should be imposed on Leeds to make up for this 442,000 tonnes of carbon? I think that's a question that we as a city are going to need to have up for public discussion, because the airport's expansion will have such a significant effect on our carbon budget. And I think those are factors that members of this panel simply cannot ignore. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Neil. This might be a good time to bring in Mr. Rees, please, if you have any answers.
Sure. Hello. Thank you very much for asking. I think my response to it, I won't comment on the carbon budget because others have a better technical view of what counts for the carbon budget and what doesn't. But what I would say is that we shouldn't kid ourselves. The extra flights to which Councillor Walshaw refers will happen somewhere else if they don't happen here, and the world doesn't care where the carbon comes from. So the idea really is to try and get people to fly locally and to try to reduce the emissions that we're currently expending on the M1 and the M62 as people fly from other airports. So the flights will still occur, but the impact on Leeds will be greater if we're not able to fly locally or fly more locally because of the additional road use. But those flights will still happen. They will happen somewhere else. They will happen further away, and that's the key point in that sense, really.
Thank you, Hal.
Chair, just if I may, sorry, apologies, Chair, but if that's a contention the applicant's making, then that needs to be presented to panel members with some kind of evidential base. And it simply won't do, I don't think, to present an argument that says, well, if we don't grant this expansion, then flights will just happen elsewhere. Because if people around the country are mindful of these issues, then those flights might not happen, that expansion might not happen elsewhere. I just don't think that argument will wash in front of this panel. So if the applicant wants to continue to make that argument, I think there's going to have to be a lot more detail to that, a lot more actual evidence to that rather than supposition. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Walshaw. Can I bring in Martin, please? Martin Elliott at this stage.
Thank you, Chair. Just really to follow on and clarify from Mr. Hills's explanation to Councillor Walshaw that the criteria within our statutory policy SP12 really does depend on what is considered to be within our gift in terms of assessing the impact and therefore the mitigation necessary. So this question of international and national flights being dealt with through other mechanisms does mean that the policy isn't seeking for those to be dealt with in this application in order to fulfill that policy.
Sorry for butting in, but I seem to have lost sound.
I don't think anybody was talking, Councillor Nash.
We've all lost it.
I can hear you, Councillor Nash. I don't think anybody's talking.
Chair, you're muted.
Yeah, I was saying, Liz, I think we all have. I certainly had. I thought I'd frozen, but if we can get back to Martin, please. And bear in mind that we did lose a little bit of your contribution.
Yeah, sorry, Joe. I don't know how much members heard of that, but the criteria that Councillor Walshaw was referring to in policy SP12 says that environmental assessment and agreed plans to mitigate adverse environmental effects, where appropriate, should be carried out. Now, what needs to be clarified, what the message that officers are getting very clearly here, is that the extent of those emissions, be they international, national, or local, is what is going to drive compliance with that aspect of criteria 3 of policy SP12. And as Mr. Hills clarified, the advice is that the international and national flights are outside of that criteria.
Thank you, Martin. David.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to come back on the point that Councillor Walshaw had raised. Councillor Walshaw raised a valid point about the impact of the airport's emissions upon the City Council's 2030 commitments under the climate change emergency. And it's the relationship, isn't it, of the impact of the airport emissions on the overall carbon budget for Leeds and the implications of that for other areas. I think that's something, Chair, we need to take away and discuss more with Polly's team and colleagues within the Climate Commission as well, so we can look at that in the round within the context of the reports which have already come through to Executive Board, Chair, the paper that went on the 17th of April last year, and then the action plan paper that went in January of this year. So it does need to be looked at within the context of that, and to quantify those figures and the impact and the relationships and the interdependencies between those aspects. So we can look at that, Chair, if that would be helpful.
Thank you, David. That's very helpful. Can we move on then and invite Councillor Wadsworth, Paul Wadsworth, please?
I hope my question will be much simpler and much shorter as well, because I'm a simple person. It's really to Carol, is my question, and it's around the passenger numbers. A lot of people have written to me and said that this application allows the airport to increase their passenger numbers from 4 million to 7 million. Is that correct, or is it a previous planning consent that they have that allowed them to increase their passenger numbers from 4 million to 7 million, which they don't intend to use? And so this application doesn't increase the passenger numbers at all from what they currently have. And
I'm sure Carol will explain that.
Right, from my understanding is that they were given planning permission in 2018 for an extension to the terminal, which you probably all remember. And as part of that application, there was a Section 106 agreement, which and it allowed them to expand to 4.5 million passengers. And they can extend to 5 million passengers, subject to a surface access strategy being submitted. So in theory, as part of previous consents, they can increase to 5 million passengers. So this application does look at them increasing from the 5 to 7 million passengers. The reason they need the new terminal is because the existing building doesn't have the space and the capacity in it to get any more people through it than probably about 4 to 4.5 million people, just because of the actual size of it, which is why they needed the extension last year to increase it to the 4.5, and why they now need a new building so that they can get 7 million people ultimately by 2030 through the door. And somewhere in the report, I can't remember which section now, it tells you a progression between now and 2030 as to when they expect to have a certain number of passengers at a certain number of years. So I hope that clarifies the question for you.
I think that was clear. Is that okay, Paul?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, moving on then. Councillor Denise Reagan, please.
Questions, Chair?
Yes. Sorry.
No questions, Chair.
No questions. Sorry, I didn't pick up on that. Thank you. Thank you, Denise. Councillor Nash.
Yes, I have a question which hasn't been mentioned in the report or in the presentation. It's of great concern to many of my constituents and to my residents that the airport no longer allows Hackney carriages to pick up and drop off at the airport. If you are successful in having this application granted, will you allow Leeds Hackney carriage taxis to visit the airport, please?
Okay, that might be a question to you, Mr. Rees.
Thank you very much, Chair. The answer is that Leeds Hackney carriages are able to drop off and collect at the airport, and they can do that in two places. They can either do it in the free parking area where they have an hour's free parking, which is a short walk from the airport terminal building, or of course they can do so through the express car park, which is much, much closer to the terminal building, but of course for which there is a small charge. In the new world, when the new terminal building is up, I mean this very sincerely, I would prefer people to come by bus rather than by taxi. I know that won't always be possible, but some of the aspects of the surface access strategy that we're putting in place, for example, busing from Leeds station direct to the airport, will hopefully enable people to do that and eliminate the need for people to come by taxi.
Thank you, Mr. Rees. Councillor Nash, is that okay?
Yes, but I am puzzled, and I don't think it's widely known, because the problem is that we have more taxis than enough queuing on New Station Street for a business at the rail station because they have nowhere to park at the airport. So that answer, although I'm pleased to hear it, surprises me greatly.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that question, Liz. Moving on, Councillor Graham Latty.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Right, a couple of questions. Over the period that this application has been before us, we've been told that the aircraft that will use this aircraft in the future, if it attracts the sort of trade that it's hoped that by having the state-of-the-art building there, that this will then make the passenger experience that much better. Therefore, we might attract the classier sort of airlines, and that with them will come aircraft which are not quite as noisy as the ones we've got now. I don't know whether they produce less carbon or not, but I would like a bit of clarification on that point, please, because I think it is quite an important point. In terms of access to the airport, road access, people are getting very, very exercised about the road, about the noise of traffic and things like that on the access to the airport. You know, you're listening to somebody who lives on the access to the airport, the Harrogate Road through Rawdon, and you know, over the last 40 years, I've seen that road go from quite a quiet road to one of the major thoroughfares of Greater Leeds. But it's not a noisy road. It's density of traffic, which is the problem, not noise. And from the point of view of the carbon emissions, you know, we're all striving towards the point where people are going to be driving electric cars. Now, that's not going to be that long after this sort of building is going to be finished. Is that something that we should be taking into account? Now then, Mr. Rees just said that he would like everybody, a great deal more people to access by bus. To me, this is sort of in the realm of wishful thinking. People, generally speaking, want the least barriers in the way of getting anywhere. And getting into your own car, generally speaking, especially when you've got a load of baggage, or getting into a taxi, is by far the easiest way. I just wonder, can anybody tell me, is Leeds unique in not having enough bus access? Does Manchester do better? But, you know, proportionally from with buses? I don't know, but I'd be very interested to hear that. Somebody said a few minutes ago that about people's attitude towards carbon reduction, etc., etc. I just wonder whether people's attitude towards COVID-19, which seems quite cavalier at times, whether people are not just as cavalier about creating excess carbon. So, one or two questions there, please.
Yes. Thank you, Graham. Just unmuting myself because my computer keeps bringing in extra emails and making a sound. Maybe Andrew Thickett could deal with the highways element and the noisy road, and perhaps somebody could suggest an officer who can talk about aircraft noises. Maybe you first, Andy.
Yes, thank you, Chair. We are just in the process of finishing the transport assessment of the airport in terms of vehicular access. And we've asked for some sensitivity work to be done, but mainly because the change in flight patterns, as they, if they worked out perfectly, would actually not impact very greatly on the current peak hours, because effectively it shifts the flights earlier. So we've just expressed an amount of skepticism that that's an idealized situation, and we wanted a bit of a sensitivity test doing, which we've received but have yet to look at. But yeah, we are aware that there will be some general growth in traffic over the day, and we're looking for looking at that very closely. The airport are looking at supporting electric vehicles in the future, and again, we've got a proposal from them to look at for a hub effectively for electric vehicle charging, so that if you arrived by electric car, you'd be able to have it charged while you were away on holiday effectively, which we think is a positive move. Again, with the bus use, the proposal is to aim for a 10% use by passengers of buses, and employee use to be, well, 30% of employees not to be travelling by private car. And the airport have put forward some suggestions that we need to beef up effectively into a Section 106 type commitment, really, to ensure that those are satisfactory. So that work's ongoing, and hopefully when we get to the next stage, we'll be able to report more fully on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. David, Caroline, somebody on aircraft noise for Councillor Latty's question?
Thank you, Chair. Richard Crowther's going to initially start. We also have a colleague from WSP, Chair, as well, who's able to advise. So I'll hand over to Richard, Chair. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Yeah, I think the question was about the confidence in quieter aircraft being attracted to the airport. Effectively, the conditions that are proposed or that we could introduce around the nighttime noise contours and the quota counts essentially mean that the airport would have to either attract the quieter aircraft or reduce the number of aircraft flying in order to meet those conditions that are proposed. So can people hear that? I can't hear anything.
Was that it?
Yeah, I heard you.
Had you finished?
Did you need to elaborate, Richard, a little bit?
So, which part would? Sorry, I thought I'd answered the question. Maybe I missed part of the question.
What I was saying was that during an address by a gentleman from the airport earlier in this process, we were told that with the new building would come the attraction of, or could welcome the attraction of some of the other airlines who at the moment turn their noses up at flying out of Leeds Bradford Airport, because the passenger experience is not as good as they would like them to have. But that with those carriers would come much improved aircraft, which were capable of carrying more people, but not as noisily, or not and not as carbon productively. And that's what I wanted elaborating on. Correction, what I would like elaborating on, please.
Sorry, I might be misunderstanding. Yes, that my understanding is that that is the proposal of the airport, and the newer aircraft that are quieter is the way in which the noise levels will be achieved in the environmental assessment. So it's the balance between larger aircraft or quieter aircraft against more aircraft. But ultimately, the aircraft, whichever aircraft fly, will be contributing to the noise climate. And so it is within the interest of the airport to ensure that the aircraft it attracts are quieter or fewer of them in order to meet those conditions.
So, are you saying that they are right? They are correct in that you know, we're not just being sold a nice idea, but that is factual. That the noise now, what we're experiencing now, is not going to be that much worse for bigger, quieter aircraft.
The noise levels that we are experiencing now, my understanding from the evidence is that potentially there could be a slight increase in noise levels than what we are experiencing now, certainly in the short term until more quieter aircraft are accessible in the market. However, the noise levels that are predicted and proposed within the environmental statement could not be, they wouldn't be exceeded if they were conditioned correctly, because they would rely on having to attract those aircraft that they've used in the prediction in order to meet their prediction. So there will be a slight increase in noise, but it couldn't be more than what they are predicting if the conditions are conditioned correctly.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
You're on mute, Chair.
I am, yes, I'm having noise background from my computer. Councillor Sharon Hamilton, please.
No questions from me, Chair.
Thank you, Sharon. Moving on, Councillor Al Garthwaite, please.
I've got several questions, Chair. Do you want me to ask them one at a time or all together?
Sorry, I've muted myself. You may as well do it all together.
Okay, so given the application is designed to meet the demand for air travel and will increase greenhouse gas emissions, would approval be contrary to paragraph 103 of the National Planning Policy Framework? Because that says that the planning system should actively manage growth through limiting the need to travel. So that's my first question. Then I've got a question about the airport parkway station and the employment hub spur. The scale of contribution from Leeds Bradford Airport, how much would that be to fund those things? And whether the business case for the airport parkway station relies on the expansion of the airport. And another question regarding that, would the employment hub spur road need to connect through White House Lane if it wasn't part of a link to the airport and the Parkway station. And then moving on to noise, the applicant admits that it will lead to an increase in noise, and if the nighttime extension is allowed, to an increase in noise in nighttime, which we get a great many complaints about in my ward and in other wards. Sorry, the cat keeps pushing my tablet over. So I can't see again how this increase in noise at night time is consistent with the aviation policy framework, which does require the aviation industry to take steps to minimise the demand for night flights and to minimise noise impact and the noise nuisance. And indeed, I'd refer to the noise policy statement for England, which expects adverse effects on health and quality of life to be minimised. And also the Leeds Best City strategy, which identifies the need to reduce pollution and noise in the city. So it seems to me contradictory to say we're going to increase noise and at some point in the future, the airplanes might get quieter, but it's sort of capped, but not really, it seems to be. So could you then confirm the prediction that the number of flights between 6 and 7 would increase even if the development doesn't go ahead? And is this based on the use of aircraft, which under current planning conditions, they may not be permitted to use? And I do think regarding health, given that the restrictions were put in 1994, as I understand it, and now a great deal more is known about the adverse effects of noise than was known then, how can it be thought that it's okay to extend it now, whereas it wasn't okay then? And also can you comment on my thinking that the main beneficiaries of the development would be the airline operators and the relatively affluent users of the airport, whereas the adverse health impacts would be felt by residents under the flight path, which includes parts of Beeston, Holbeck, Hunslet and Riverside, Middleton Park, Bermontoft, Richmond Hill, Armley, Little London and Woodhouse, Burley, Kirkstall and Headingley. It seems to me disproportionate that consumers from the higher social and economic groups would benefit at the expense of those of others. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Alan. Maybe I should have taken your advice and taken the questions one at a time. There's an awful lot there, but I do know that Carol can answer a number of those, and I'll start with Carol. You'll have to remind us if we miss some, Al, and we probably will. Carol, please.
Thank you, Chair. There's quite a lot of questions there, so it's difficult to know in which order to answer them. I've written some brief notes, and correct me if I've missed some of the questions. But in relation to the MPPF, I think we've already had questions about the scheme in relation to the MPPF, which we said we would take some legal advice on and come back to you with another paper regarding the impact on the actual MPPF. I'm trying to remember what the other questions were.
I had a question about the scale of contribution from the airport to fund the airport parkway station and the employment hub spur, and then whether it relied, well, there was a couple of supplementary ones, but I'll take that first.
Okay, yeah. As part of the surface access strategy that we're dealing with and we're negotiating with the airport on, is that they are looking to add some money towards the airport station, and they're looking to supplement public transport to the station in terms of additional buses and whatever. We haven't got specific financial figures regarding that yet. What we're looking at the moment is trying to work out the modal splits, so trying to work out the percentage of people that will move from the car to the buses and will move from the car to the railway station. And then when we know what percentage of those are, we can then equate that to a financial sum which we can put into the Section 106 agreement. So it's still being negotiated with them at the moment, but the airport are looking to make a contribution to the station. It's just the precise monetary value for that at the moment has not been established.
Okay. Does the business case for the station rely on expansion of the airport?
I don't know the answer to that one. I don't know if Andy Thickett has got any more additional information on background to do with the station regarding that point.
Okay, Andy, can I bring you in at this point?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I have actually asked for clarification from Wyker on that, because it's Wyker that are driving the station. I think that it's not that the airport is reliant on the station for growth, but the business case for the station is assuming a certain amount of use by airport passengers. But as I say, we're looking to get a precise clarification on that. But just to add probably to what Carol was saying, is that the road between the station and the employment hub is currently at a very early stage in feasibility work. But what we do know is that it won't be passing through the airport operational boundary. So it approximately it'll follow the line of Scotland Lane. But as part of this application and the contribution, if you like, that the airport is making to the connection to the station, they are offering land for a link road to effectively create a link between the new road to the employment hub and the new terminal. So which will allow the circulation of the shuttle bus effectively from the station to the airport and the employment hub, and that they'll also provide the funding towards the shuttle bus as well.
Yeah. Yes, my question was really whether the employment hub spur road would need to connect through to White House Lane if it wasn't part of that link.
Well, the employment hub is to the to the opposite side of White House Lane to the airport. So the route of that road effectively will come from the station that Carol pointed out to the east of the airport. It will come up, roughly follow the line of Scotland Lane, and then at some point it'll be a mixture of following White House Lane and taking junctions off into the employment hub. So that's what that road will do, and what the airport are doing are providing the land to provide a link road through the airport to join up to that road from the terminal. It's very difficult to explain without a plan to point to, but that's the principle of it.
Oh, okay. I'll go back to it and look at that. My next questions were about noise, and given that it will relaxing the night flights controls will lead to an increase and noise, how is it consistent with the aviation policy framework and the noise policy statement for England, and indeed the Leeds Best City strategy?
Okay, Richard, are you coming in on this?
Yes, Chair. In regards to the aviation policy framework, minimising the demand for flights, I'm afraid I can't really. I'm not in a position to answer how this would meet the requirement to minimise the demand for flights. But in terms of minimising the impact of noise nuisance, the application is proposing to introduce mitigation measures through noise insulation policies and other flight restrictions in order to minimise the impact. So the argument would be that through this process, we would determine what level of mitigation we consider acceptable.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard.
And the noise policy statement for England, I suppose it's the same. It's all about mitigation. Yes. Okay.
I think one of the other questions I think you raised was about the increase in flights at night using aircraft that are not allowed at the moment.
That's right.
So obviously, the part of this application is to change the nighttime conditions controlling aircraft, and the application does state that the reason it wants to do that is in the short term to be able to operate some aircraft that currently are not allowed to do so. But without the development, the argument is that some aircraft would be exempt, and so the numbers of aircraft could still increase. But that isn't necessarily to the level of which they wish the airport to develop.
No.
Thank you, Richard.
Well, okay. So how come the removal of limits is now seen as more acceptable than it was in 1994?
I'm not necessarily saying that it is more acceptable. The noise limits that were set last time around took regard for the fact that aircraft generally were noisier, but the conditions for nighttime flights were very strict. This application is requesting that they are slightly relaxed. The conditions would still be considered fairly strict compared to most airports, and the increase in noise levels would be fairly minimal and mitigated, or could be mitigated. And that's really where the determination needs to decide on whether the levels of mitigation are adequate for the proposed increase.
I see. Thank you. Yes.
Okay. I'm probably the only member here today that was involved in the 94 extension. I was on planning. I was chair of planning in those days. So I remember well. Graham, were you on? I've just seen you nod.
No, that was just before my time. But living here, I do remember that being built.
I know, I remember it. 10,000 objections, yes. I'm not sure if any of the current planning officers were involved in that, actually. But I guess the short answer to that really is 94, it was a very different world than there is in 2020 in simple terms. Okay. A lot of the answers you didn't fully get, Al, I'm sure when the final reports come out, they'll be fully answered. We'll need to answer that. There's a lot of unknowns at the moment if we read a report, and we're waiting for quite a lot of reports from highways and several other. This is not a complete report in any stretch of imagination.
That was why I thought it was worth raising some of these questions now.
Indeed, good questions. Well done. Okay, moving on then. Councillor Dan Cohen. Dan, please.
Thank you, Chair. And I have to say, Chair, 26 years ago, you said you were chairing plans. Well, I didn't think it was allowed at 10 years old to do such a thing. So there we
You're
go.
so kind.
You live and learn, Chair. I have three questions. The first is really born of concern as much for colleagues as anything else. And maybe it's something that Legal and David might be able to give some guidance on. Where colleagues have previously made public pronouncements against air travel and airport expansion, are they at risk of being held to predetermine an application? And if they would be, what would be the risk to them of that? Question one. Question two, what would be the economic impact on the city, a city that is looking to recover from the impacts of COVID on our region's economy? What would be the economic impact of not proceeding with this application? What would the costs be? And finally, Chair, sorry, somebody's trying to come through to me. And finally, Chair, how do we take into account, we've got noise impact primarily, but obviously, as Councillor Walsall referred to, carbon impact. But how do we take into account the impact of what will undoubtedly over the next 10, 20, 30 years and beyond be quieter, cleaner aircraft coming through that we don't, we have technology today that 26 years ago, when you were a slip of a lad, we would never have dreamt of being around. The same is absolutely going to be the case in 10, 15, 20 years from now. The technology, the aeronautic technology, is going to be worlds away. Do we ignore that development? How do we work that? They're my three questions, Chair.
Thank you, Dan. Very kind of you to make your remarks. Moving on, can I ask Matt, please, Matt Hills, to answer the first legal question?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Cohen, for your question. There's a difference between being predisposed and being predetermined. Members are, by virtue of the office that they hold, likely in some situations to be predisposed to an outcome which is different to predetermination. It's really down to the individual member. Predetermination is not allowed. If you feel you can't, as a member on a plans panel, make an objective and reasoned decision because you've already made up your mind, then that member ought to exclude themselves from that panel. If, however, you are predisposed because you've had some local involvement, for instance, or anything else of that matter, you're still entitled as a member of the plans panel to sit on the panel, so long as that member is confident that they can approach the application with a clear and unbiased mind and can make their determination accordingly. So ultimately, it's a matter for that member, really, as to whether they feel they're able to do that. I hope that helps.
That was, am I muted? I'm not sure. Sorry. That was very clear, Matt. Thank you. Moving on to David. Perhaps the other two questions, and perhaps you can predict the future in 20 or 30 years while you're at it for us.
I wish I could, Chair. I think on the economic point, I think Eve would be able to comment on that part first of all, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, good afternoon, Chair and everybody. So just addressing Councillor Cohen's points, the sort of economic assessment that was submitted is more of a forward kind of potential forecast of what jobs might be created rather than a what if we don't proceed. And that forecast does set out almost 12,000 jobs that would be created through this work, and our independent assessment of the submission confirmed that that economic assessment was robust. I do appreciate that we've had some evidence submitted subsequently, which we haven't yet had time to assess, but our external kind of peer review by Genecon did suggest that the jobs forecast that was made was actually potentially conservative in terms of the impact of the airport. So that's where we stand with that economic assessment at the moment. And I would say that you know, the importance of having a kind of an airport that can operate effectively in terms of not just our economy in Leeds, but the regional economy is really important in terms of the context of imports and exports, in terms of kind of businesses looking to grow, particularly in the post-Brexit context, not just from a tourism angle, although that is also important.
Thank you, Eve. And back to the future.
just on that point, Chair. I mean, I think Councillor Cohen raises a valid point that, you know, technological change moves at a pace, doesn't it, in terms of new infrastructure and new types of mobility, etc. And you know, we're in a very different world from the one in the early 1990s that you described before. So I think colleagues from the airport have sort of given a bit of a context as to some of the technological advances in air travel, but in terms of the specific application that's in front of us and this position statement, then it's something we can look at perhaps through conditions in terms of how do we ensure that future proofing is embedded as part of the consideration of this proposal, so we are making the best use of technology as that is developed, and getting to the 2030 target that Councillor Walshaw mentioned at the top of the meeting. That is a huge challenge, but I think equally it's been accepted that there will need to be a transition to that target, but we need to be moving as quickly as we realistically can, Chair. Thank you.
That's helpful, David. It reminds me of the philosopher who was asked the very question, what will the future look like? And he cogitated and thought about it for a while and then turned to them and said, the future will not be like the past. I think that's the best thing we can say. Things will change as they did from 94 to 2020. And hopefully it's good change. Moving on then, Councillor Khalil. Peter?
Thank you, Chair. I've got a few questions, as you might expect. If you don't mind, I'll...
I might deal with them one at a time, if you don't mind, Peter. You know.
Not a problem. Yeah, I can do this. So first, thank you to David Feeney for promising that we'd get a bit more work on how this application may fit into different legal frameworks we've got around, in response, I think, to Councillor Walshaw's points at first. The other point I just wanted to raise on that, and whether I could get either some part of an answer now and then a further answer later. At West Yorkshire, there is work going on around setting targets and pathways to decarbonisation of transport, which many members of Leeds are obviously involved with. The reports that are coming through so far haven't come up with policy arrangements, but have come up with recommendations which do cover regional airports. For instance, within the report, the pathways that have been suggested to meet their 2038 goal at West Yorkshire include domestic aviation reducing by 20% and international aviation static or limited to a 25% increase. Given that we are a constituent council of the West Yorkshire Combined Authority, should we as members be taking account of that work that's emerging as part of this? And I'll leave that as the first question, and then I do have some other details on the report to come back.
Thank you, Peter. Who wants to answer that one? Always look at you, David. Perhaps you could suggest somebody.
I'm happy to start, Chair. I don't know if other colleagues would like to come in, but I think that's a helpful observation, Councillor Cahill. I think we are increasingly working, aren't we, within that sub-regional context, and we are working on a number of fronts on the sort of low carbon agenda through those networks and connections. So I certainly think it's valid to look at that. I think we need to understand what stage the work has got to and what the level and nature of the interventions are, but certainly happy to take that away and have a look at it. I think one of the challenges in this whole area in terms of airport growth and infrastructure is the relationship of different airports across different geographies, and I think the way policy is set up, it sort of looks at flights sort of nationally and internationally, but in a national perspective, it's sort of the southeast and the rest of the country. So anything we can do that's trying to coordinate activity and manage things in a better way, well, that would be significantly useful. So we can take that away and have a look at that, Chair, if that would be helpful.
That would be very helpful, David. Peter, next question.
Thank you. Just to add to that, I think very useful to look at that work, but I'd like to see also, as a member that's involved in that work at West Yorkshire, but on behalf of Leeds, how much legal basis I should take, how much material consideration I should make on that work when I'm making a decision, given that the recommendations that seem to be coming through there do bear quite a stark resonance to the application we're looking at. Just wanted to make then a couple of points of clarification for myself on the report. Well, first at 10.62 on the report, it's very clear, I think, that the airport is seeking to expand to that 7 million passengers per annum. We've got a statement from the applicant there that says that the new terminal is in part to support that growth. That's obviously what they're going to. So I think we can be clear about that. Just one quick point of clarification on 10.18. It states that the greenhouse gas emissions overall within the Leeds district will increase from 2.1% to 2.5%. I'm guessing on that we're not taking account of the fact that many of the other sectors and emissions around the city are expected to reduce very substantially by then. Certainly the work on transport done at West Yorkshire level shows that although these will be a modest increase in today's emissions, the reduction in emissions in all other sectors mean that the airport will be quite a major emitter by the time we get to that 2030 level. I just wondered whether that was taken into account, if I could have a quick comment from the planning officer maybe on that.
Okay. Carol, do you
Yeah,
want to start?
I think what we're saying at the moment is that there will be a 0.4% increase as part of this planning application. But what the airport and the applicants are doing in the background at the moment is they're looking into this further, and they're seeing if they can bring this 0.4% down. They're hoping that if they can get it to a level where it ends up as stable. So that, and they're looking to do that by a surface access strategy, which they're working on at the moment. So does that answer the question in terms of this is the worst case scenario at the moment, the 0.4%, and they hope to hopefully bring it down to even less by the time this application comes back to you.
Is that helpful, Peter?
Okay, yeah, I'll accept that as an answer. I think obviously by the time we get to 2030, it may not be 2% of the emissions in the city, because we may find that the overall emissions of the city have reduced considerably, and therefore by that point the decisions we would make at 2030 may be slightly different, given that we'd be in a different position. Going on then to my wider question, I just wanted to touch on the and this will be I've only got a couple more now, Chair. The clawback question I think we've got here, because this argument's been around, and I know officers have tried to clarify and to come up with quantification for does increased flights at Leeds allow passengers who are currently travelling elsewhere to fly more locally, thus reducing those emissions. I was just very confused by that 17% figure and how it was worked out. I think if we look at the cumulative impact of the overall emissions for the airport, so I'm including scope 1, 2 and 3, we see 400,000 tonnes of cumulative impact of CO2 emissions. And by my reckoning, that, doing my amateur sums, is 22 million car journeys to Manchester that would have to take place in order to equate those. So an explanation of that 17%, but also can I just ask for this clarification? Are we assuming that if 17% of those passengers fly out of Leeds, that Manchester Airport are going to stop those flights leaving their airport? Because I'm imagining in the market economy we have, Manchester, rather than suddenly seeking smaller planes or to run fewer flights, are going to seek for customers elsewhere. So I'm just a bit confused by how that quantification works. And I can't really see a reduction in flights in other airports being caused by people going from one to the other. And just to count, my 22 million people driving to Manchester takes account they're all using private cars rather than anyone getting on the train or using more sustainable transport. So I'd just like to go into that detail a bit more if I can, Chair.
I think that's a fair question. I think we've all puzzled on that one. Don't know how we're going to deal with it.
Chair, I think Richard, Chair, should be able to pick up that question. That would be
Richard?
helpful.
Yes, I'll hopefully explain it a little bit better, and I think it probably came across in the technical report. There was a separate technical note presented by the applicant, which presented information from the Civil Aviation Authority, which suggested that there was, I think it was about 2.5 million journeys in 2018 from passengers who were travelling to Manchester Airport that lived closer to Leeds Bradford Airport. And the calculations were looked at and estimated that approximately 32,000 tonnes per year of carbon would be saved if those journeys all diverted to Leeds Bradford Airport. So the 17% figure is 17% of that 32,000 tonnes would equal the predicted increase due to increased passenger numbers at Leeds Bradford Airport. And yes, it is only assessing surface access emissions, not including aircraft emissions, as was discussed at the beginning.
Okay, Mr. Rees, do you have a comment?
Thank you, Chair. I'm very conscious, and I've been very conscious listening to a lot of the questions, that many of them are very technical questions which have very good technical answers.
Yeah.
If I may, Mr. Chair, I'd like to involve Tim Waring, who's on the call, from Quad, who's our technical advisor, who I think will be able to give members much fuller answers than perhaps I'm able to give. So with your permission, Mr. Chair, I'd like to call on Tim.
Yes, welcome, Tim.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you all. In terms of the clawback element and what that means for carbon, we've carried out some work which we presented to your officers, and that is currently being reviewed by our officers, which demonstrates what the level of carbon impact of the development is going forward from today's date. For the surface access, I'm leaving aside the aviation, and for the good reasons that Matt Hills mentioned, dealing just with the surface access elements. What that work demonstrates, and I don't want to go into the detail of it here because it's probably not appropriate given it's not before yourselves, but very simply what it demonstrates is that there will be an increase in carbon impact from the surface access strategy if no mitigation takes place. What we are proposing through the surface access strategy is a number of mitigation measures that will actually reduce that carbon impact, and that carbon impact will be primarily reduced by improving access to the airport by public transport. It also assumes that the train station will come online as well at some point in the next 5 years, which is a commitment from WICA. It also addresses EV charging and the improvements for and hydrogen charging as well, perhaps for buses and for taxis. And with those mitigations and the natural improvement, and going back to Councillor Latty's point, a natural improvement with vehicle efficiencies and movement towards electric vehicles that is going to happen throughout the nation as well as the world, we get to a carbon position that is exactly the same, or near enough, damn it, the same as we have at the moment. That doesn't take account of the clawback of trade or passengers from other airports. And we've done a further piece of work, which Mr. Crowther refers to, which demonstrates that actually, if you claw back trade, and bring back passengers who are currently travelling to more distant airports. And it's not just Manchester, but it's East Midlands, it's Newcastle, and it's even London. People get in their cars to drive to London. If you do that, then actually you can reduce the carbon effects of the surface access strategy even further. But what we're saying is that even if you don't take account of that clawback, the proposition that is presented here by 2030 is that there will be no increase in quantum of carbon emissions from the airport's expansion to 7 million. I hope that's helpful, but there is some information that is presented back to officers, which we are still in discussions with them, and I'm sure that it will form part of the officers' report when it comes before you for determination.
Thanks, Tim. That's very helpful. Thanks, Hal. David, can you confirm that we will have that report when the application comes before us next?
That's fine, Chair. We can pick up on all of the matters that have been raised this afternoon, Chair, and look at everything in the round. I mean, we do need to pull together a comprehensive and thorough report which takes on board all of the information, Chair. So I think this has been a very useful session in flushing out these issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Peter,
Thank you,
did
Chair.
that conclude?
Then, well, one more based on out of that and the others, because I think it's very clear that then, well, one small question on that fact then, regarding the clawback, are we going to be seeing an increase in domestic flights at Leeds Bradford Airport due to this? Because I think there's a very good argument there that flights that cannot be taken out of Leeds Bradford at the moment, for instance, to extremely exotic destinations of the likes that I could only dream of visiting, many of those only exit from the larger airports in the southeast London area. Are there going to be an increase in domestic flights from the airport? In which case, are we taking that reverse clawback into consideration of people who may be flying to London in order to get a flight to an exotic destination rather than taking the train to London, which would be a much more sustainable method? And then, sorry, Chair, I've got one more to come back to. I apologise.
Okay, Mr. Rees and Mr. Waring, please, perhaps you could deal with that on the balance of domestic flights and international flights.
Well, shall I deal? I'll deal with the exotic destination question, and then perhaps hand over to Tim.
It's not fair in these lockdown times, really, is it?
Well, firstly, I think it's important to realise that a lot of our longer distance destinations are the ones most heavily used by business traffic. So a lot of the long distance traffic that currently goes out on the KLM flight via Amsterdam, hubs out of Amsterdam to an easterly direction, and business people I know find that very valuable, especially if they're doing business in the Middle East or the Far East or indeed in the United States. As far as domestic is concerned, I honestly, if LBA doesn't have a flight, we currently don't have a flight to London, in fact. The only flights I think it will be sensible for LBA to operate in the future will be the longer distance flights for point to point that people can't do sensibly, or if people are hubbing, obviously through Heathrow, if people are hubbing and going to the States, for example, then it does make sense for there to be some connectivity to Heathrow to link up for those US flights. A lot of people at the moment are flying to Amsterdam to catch flights to the United States. I would like to see that transfer traffic preferably going through Heathrow to help give people that option, that choice, because at the moment they only have one choice, that is Amsterdam. But if I may take a good example of a destination that is served currently by LBA that can't sensibly be served by rail, and that's Newquay. It's a very successful route that we have out of LBA. At the moment, by surface transport, whether it's rail or road, it takes about a day to travel to Newquay and a day to travel back. So any business person wanting to do business in Cornwall has to, basically it's a 3-day trip in order to do a site visit to that part of Cornwall. I would hope that everybody would agree that a fast, efficient, domestic and frequent domestic service to Newquay is a very good idea. So I want to minimize domestic traffic, but clearly I do want to give people the choice they need. But if I can hand over now to Tim to give perhaps a more technical answer to the technical aspects of that question, I'd be grateful.
Do please, Tim.
Thank you, Howell. I'm afraid I can't really answer the technicalities of it, other than to say that as part of the assessment that we've undertaken, we do recognise that we will have to take account of any potential impacts from domestic flights, and that has been taken into account as part of the clawback, or it is in the work that we've undertaken. So I think the difficulty that we have is that the clawback of passengers is difficult to quantify with a great level of certainty. But there is a kind of a range of scenarios that we can and have presented to officers that demonstrate what that clawback could mean. But I completely agree with Mr. Cowell that we do need to take account of any counter or checks and balances that might arise because of the impact of more domestic flights.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Hyle. Can we go back to Peter? Have you had another small
Sorry,
question?
Chair, there is just then one further, because obviously it's very clear. So thank you for those answers. I do appreciate that many of these are technical matters, but I think all of those technical matters are ones that members will be seeking answers to before they make a decision on this, in order to make a balanced decision, as we all will be seeking to make. Just on the report around 10.23 and 10.24, it's been clear in all those answers that whenever we are looking at the carbon emissions from the airport, we're looking at the surface carbon emissions of scope 1 and scope 2. Obviously, there are points to members here, and I've asked for legal questions before, whether members should be regarding the impact of international flights as a planning consideration in this. And it's questioned in the report whether we should be asking whether that affects the ability for the UK to meet the Paris Agreement and such. That question seems to still be with members to make that decision, and members seem to be required by this to weigh up those options. Therefore, I'm a bit concerned that all of the figures I have here are regarding the surface access to the airport and the climate emission and the carbon emissions on ground level, whereas members may decide that they want to factor in some of those other emissions as part of this. And I think the report doesn't really give us the opportunity to seek whether those emissions will affect some of those national strategies. I think obviously on the CORSIA point, it would be very useful to have some documentation from CORSIA saying that they feel that expansions such as this do fit in with the plan that they are undertaking to mitigate impacts, because otherwise I'm afraid we're just saying there's a group there doing something that unfortunately I haven't seen the detail of what they're doing or whether they hope to achieve it. And I wonder whether that's something that the Chief Planning Officer would be able to comment on, whether that further detail would be there to allow members really to look at this in the round.
Okay, David. David?
Sorry, Chair, I was just on mute. I think Matt was going to come back in on the legal point. So I'll just move into the second point. Yes, we need to understand, don't we, the role of CORSIA and where that sits in terms of the detail of the responsibility and how we move that on. So again, that's something we can take away and have a look at in a bit more detail, Chair.
Okay. Can we leave it there, Peter? It
was just the legal. Just the legal point, Chair.
Okay, sorry,
in response to
Matt.
Councillor Cahill's first question. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for the question, Councillor. It's a bit of a tricky one because the Climate Change Act 2008 is the act that specifically defines the country's net zero carbon goal. But the act itself is only actually binding on the Secretary of State. So this planning decision, much like all planning decisions, has to be determined within the normal scheme and framework of so doing, in accordance with the development plan, unless material considerations indicate otherwise. So although this council is not bound specifically by that target in that act, I also can't say that it's immaterial. So, and of course, there are other local mechanisms as well, such as the climate change emergency, by which this would fall to be considered as a material consideration. So I hope that clears it up slightly in relation to the targets that are in the statutes, because it is a little complicated, but hopefully that explains it somewhat at least.
Okay, I think we'll have to leave it there for the moment,
Thank
Matt.
you, Chair. Yeah.
I am aware that Peter, I'm aware that I have a member who will be leaving soon for family medical reasons. So I want to give that
That's all
person a
my
chance
questions,
to
Chair,
ask
though.
a
Thank you.
question.
Yeah.
So can I bring in Councillor Campbell, please?
Thank you, Chair. Can I just say that Mr. Hill's explanation made it even more complex and opaque. Can I suppose, ask questions in two areas. One thing that nobody's actually mentioned is the technicalities or the detail of the building itself. And when we were being shown the slides, I've got a couple of questions. Number one is, do we actually think there, for departing passengers, do we actually think there are enough seats? I'm looking at slide 10 that we had there. And on slide 15, it showed a nice bush shelter. And as we all know, the weather up at Yeadon is consistently balmy. But the shelter itself appeared to be not fit for purpose. So I'm assuming that we'll be fitting more appropriate shelters rather than visually pleasing. So those two, which are easy ones to answer. There are, Councillor Walshaw, Councillor Garthwaite and Councillor Cahill have really raised the issue. We can't really get our head round what appear to be technical answers given by people with technical expertise, and it's very difficult for lay people to get their head around that. So when we talk about there being a minimal increase, or the pollution will be negligibly worse, I think I'd like these things to be quantified, because I've heard in the past when people have said to us, oh, it'll only be slightly worse, and it actually turns out to be fairly horrendous for the people who have to suffer it. And particularly, I'm interested in this clawback, and I'm sorry to come back to it again, because it sounds fine, but I cannot, and I'm unable to find any hard evidence that this thing works. So in theory, if people don't go to Manchester and fly from Yeadon, that's less carbon. But as I think as Peter said, it doesn't mean that Manchester is going to close down. So it may be slightly less in one area, but it's not an overall decrease. And it appears to be totally aspirational. So are there any hard, fast figures relating to that? Second point relates to Lizzie's point with the Hackney carriages, and the talk about preference for most people to come on the bus rather than a taxi. I'm assuming, therefore, the airport's pet taxi company would be disappearing. But I draw your attention to 10.11, and have officers agreed 10.11 on page 49, which is the removal of the 1 hour free pickup and drop off, which seems to me to be detrimental, because it will push vehicles onto the surrounding road network. The other thing is, in relation to the railway station, our officers saying to us that the railway station can be taken into account with regard to this application, or that we shouldn't take it into account because as yet it's still a twinkle in Wyker's eye. Right, thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Colin. A number of questions there. Carol, do you want to start regarding the seating? That might be the
Yeah,
easiest questions.
I'll start and answer what I can answer, and then move on to other officers if they can help. In terms of the seating, I don't have an answer as to how many seats are proposed. But what I can do is find that answer out from the airport, and we can perhaps get some information as to how many people they would expect to be in the departure lounge for a typical hour. Before we come back to Pan's panel again, to give you an idea of how many people will be there for an hour and how many seats are available within that hour. In terms of the bus shelters, that image was just a CGI to give you an impression of what the bus shelter potentially would look like. At the moment, officers are negotiating with them, and it's likely that we will put conditions on as to what the bus shelters will ultimately look like, to make sure that they are protective for the people who will use them. In terms of the only other one I can answer from the questions that you've given is in relation to the free car parking. Officers haven't agreed to the proposal for the free car parking at the moment. The airport have put this forward, and in the report under 10.11, I've given you the airport's reasons as to why they consider that free 1 hour car parking should be removed. I think one thing you have to remember about it, the cars going out onto the highway, is that when the free car park was put in a few years ago, people could park on the highway and they could park around the airport, and it was seen as being a highway safety issue. We now have the red zone, which does stop people parking on the streets around the airport. So the car parking may not be needed on a safety issue as much as it did do when you dealt with this a few years ago. But I think it's up to members ultimately to decide whether they are happy with the airport's proposal for the removal of the free car park for the reasons that they've given in that report. Those are the only ones that I can answer out of that. I don't know if Andy can help you regarding the whether the railway station is being taken into account and is required as part of the airport development.
Over to you, Andy.
Yeah, thank you. Microphone in the right place. Yeah, just to add to Carol's point, I think as well on the red route that if we were going to lose the 1 hour free car park, we'd look to extend the red route round to sort of Scotland Lane and what have you, because the likelihood is that there'll be a pedestrian route from Scotland Lane up to the terminal. So, but yeah, clearly it's that fundamental question of whether members' view on supporting the removal of it. In terms of the railway station, what the airport's stated right from the outset is that they want to expand to 7 million without increasing car parking, but that they reserve the right to increase it by about 700 spaces if necessary. In order to not, at the moment, they've got about just over 7,000 spaces, and there's probably about generally a couple of thousand spare. So they have got some room to expand within the existing car park in terms of the amount of car parking that occurs. But in order to control the level of cars that arrive and hence car parking that's required, they do need to have a mode share shift away from public transport use for both passengers and employees. So the airport does, sorry, the station does feature in that assumption, insofar as they currently assume that without the station they could achieve a 10% shift from to public transport, and that with the station they could achieve a 15% shift. We're still working through the final figures that have been submitted to effectively identify if that failure in public transport shift if there was a failure in it, what that would mean in terms of car parking and additional traffic on the road. So yes, the station is featuring in the round, but this is based on the assessment at 2030, and the delivery of the station, all being well, will be well in advance of that. And so, for instance, there is also a 2024 assessment which suggests that they can manage with less of a shift to public transport. They currently have about 5% by bus, and if they get to 7.5% by bus in 2024, they can accommodate that within the existing car parking with some spare. So it's more looking to that long-term 2030, 7 million passengers is the need for the station.
Okay, thank you, Andy.
Can I just
Does
come
that
back?
goes, do please?
Well, a couple of points. I think Carol's slightly inaccurate when we talk about the red zone stopping people doing it. Part of the rationale for installing the red zone and part of the rationale for agreeing to the red zone was that there was an alternative which allowed you to drop people off without incurring the charge. And so what we appear to be saying here is we would use traffic regulation orders to push people into paid parking, which I'm not sure about. Can I just ask a couple of questions? I forgot to put this one in.
Go ahead.
If we talk about numbers of people using public transport, and prior to this application, there have been several where the airport have indicated a willingness to go for a larger proportion by public transport, but they never seem to have hit that figure. Could we actually put a condition on that, say in 2030, if the railway station is open, 20% of the people going to the airport have to come by public transport? And in relation to quotas again, going back to the aircraft noise and the change of hours, currently there are no restrictions on the daytime use. We would put in a new daytime use. Could we, as an authority, put a different set of quota conditions on, say, the 6 till 7 slot? So if we wished to, could we have a quota of that are only allowed, say, those with a quota count of 0.25 to land and take off during that hour? Okay, thanks, Chair.
Good questions. Who wants to answer it? I haven't heard from Jonathan or Daljit. Do you want to start this off, and then maybe we'll move to Richard Crowder? John?
Yeah, well, I think these are rather technical questions in terms of the noise quota count, which Richard is obviously better placed to respond specifically on that. And then in terms of the passenger numbers, perhaps Andrew can advise us as to whether we've actually conditioned a specific percentage to be forced down a modal shift in previous applications. I'm not sure whether it would be an enforceable condition, but Andrew might be able to advise on his experience of other developments.
Okay, Andrew?
Yeah, that's right. Well, the current, the consent on the current terminal requires, if you like, the airport to pay a certain contribution towards public transport on the base until it hits a certain percentage public transport use, which has never quite worked probably as well as it should have done, but certainly the airport does pay a contribution towards the running of the public buses to the airport. So I think what we've got to very carefully do is structure a Section 106 agreement that ties financial contributions to performance in terms of percentage use by public transport and, if you like, the failure of that and the impacts that that would bring to off-site highway infrastructure. And certainly that's something that we need to work through now.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. And Richard, regarding the lower noise levels that Councillor Campbell suggested.
So yeah, that's slightly complicated. In theory, yes, a condition could be put forward to limit movements or aircraft types at any time of the day or night. I think the practicalities in terms of the figure used by Councillor Campbell is that the application is requesting the ability to depart with quarter count 1 during the night until 2025. So it would be a case of whether the airport could actually achieve that condition. And I'm afraid I'm not really in a position to say how you would then go about choosing whether that was an acceptable condition or not.
Thank you, Richard. Councillor Campbell?
Well, sorry, but I thought we were the ones who were setting the conditions, not in response to what the airport would necessarily like. So if we as a panel believed that to protect the amenity of residents, we would want if it was agreed, we would want a quarter count. And I pulled 0.25 out of the air because it just happens to be a figure that has been thrown back at me. But if we wished to put that type of condition on, we could do that, is what you're saying to us.
That's my understanding, yes, Councillor.
Okay.
Chair, if I could come in here.
Do, Dalgid.
There are clear legal tests for applying planning conditions. It's not just a case of whether they're considered necessary. We would have to give thought to whether what we were proposing was reasonable, proportionate and enforceable. So that needs to be looked at in the round with colleagues. I completely understand the sentiment of Councillor Campbell, that as officers we would need to ensure that we were taking a reasonable position and that those conditions were enforceable. And it'd be on that basis that we'd come back to you with the report.
Okay, can we leave it there, Colin?
Yes, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Kaylee Brooks, please. Been a long time waiting, I know, Kaylee.
Oh yes, I'm very patient, aren't I, Chair?
You are.
Everyone's done a lovely job though. Yeah, I've got a couple of questions though, if I may. So paragraph 10.16, it's the table I've got some questions about there. So is this table based on current or projected future aviation technology is my first question. And also, how does this table sort of compare to other airports, operational airports at the moment of similar size in terms of emissions? And I suppose also in terms of the future technologies that have been mentioned, the hydrogen and electric and all that stuff, I'm wondering what kind of time frame we're looking at for them to be operational within domestic flights as well. So yeah, I'll leave you with those, please.
Okay, can I start off with you, Richard? Richard?
Sorry, yes, I was just trying to find the table, Chair.
It's on page 50.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in terms of the in terms of carbon emissions, I'm afraid I'm not really able to explain how these emissions from the aircraft are based on existing or future technology, the airport might be able to give more clarification on that. Obviously, the assessment has been based on their flight modelling, and these are the emissions that they're predicting. I have no specific technical knowledge to question the technology assumed and how that would affect the flight emissions.
Okay.
Is somebody from the airport able to?
Maybe Tim Waring can help, but obviously you were the obvious person to come to from a council viewpoint. Yes. Tim, please.
Thank you, Councillor McKenna. I think as a number of you know around the table, I'm a mere town planner and not a climate change specialist. We have got somebody in the team who isn't here today, but we can certainly answer that question in response. In terms of the technological advances, there has been some account taken in the EIA of those, and we have adopted, as you are required under environmental impact assessment regulations, to adopt a worst case. So we have adopted a worst case based on reasonable assumptions, but we can respond specifically on that technical question through the officers for the next time this comes before you.
Yeah.
Hope that helps.
Mr. Chairman, perhaps I could add a little bit more colour to that, if I may.
Do please.
For Councillor Brooks, the modelling is based on aircraft technology as we anticipated will improve over time, and as we anticipate aircraft orders will come on stream. So as time goes on, so it's assumed in the model that the technological level of the aircraft improves with time. So it's a bit of both. Today is as we are today, and as we move through, so the aircraft technology becomes improved as time goes on. So it is taken account in the modelling, yes.
Okay.
I come back, Chair.
Do please.
So in terms of the modelling, has it been assumed that there's a sort of 50% reduction in emissions as per year or something like that? And is that a sustainable basis? Like whole fleets would have to be replaced. I don't know. Like I'd like a bit more clarity on that, and I'd like also to see it going up to 2050, because that's the government's own what's it called, the Climate Change Act. So I'd like to see that up to 2050. I can understand why you've put it up to 2030 because that's our climate emergency, but yeah, I'd like to see the longer term impacts of that.
Okay. David, is that something we could consider when we get the application before us?
We can include that in the list, Chair. I think Mr. Waring had sort of made reference anyway to further work, so perhaps we could just incorporate it into that piece.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kaylee. Moving on, Councillor Blackburn. David?
Thank you, Chair. It's been a long wait. I keep crossing questions off, I have. First of all, can I just pick up on the question that Keeley just asked, Councillor Brooks asked, because I don't actually think we got a correct answer there. Because it says about the anticipated performance, but is it anticipated performance of technology we know about, or is it what we expect the performance to be from the technology by then?
Okay. Do we have a technocrat who's going to answer that question? No, nobody's rushing in to answer that one for you, David. Maybe it's something that we can include on the report, Mr. Feeney.
If we can find out about that, because I always remember back in 1970s when we had the oil crisis, motor vehicles performance were going to be so great. Well, as a result of the oil crisis in the 70s, they improved dramatically. But when oil prices came down, they didn't improve any very much in next few years. So I'm just wondering, is the technology there to do it? And that's all. Right, and then my next question. It says in the report that from when it mentions the objections about Stansted and Bristol airports, and that they've had expansion applications turned down, and it says due to damage on climate. What I want to know is if they can bring climate change into it, why is the problem with us bringing climate change into it?
Matt, that may be a question for you.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'll just, first of all, Councillor Blackburn, I'm not saying there's a problem with bringing climate change into it, but it's important to, I suppose it's important to look at it as, you know, it's going to be a material consideration in your deliberations when this application comes to be determined. So to say that we can't bring it in, I think that's not correct. I think it would, you know, it would be a material consideration that you would have to consider as decision makers. In terms of Bristol and Stansted, these two airports are at the appeal stage. Appeals have been submitted to the Planning Inspectorate by both respective airport owners, managers. Unfortunately, at the moment, that's all we know. The airports have submitted their appeals. We don't know when those appeals are going to be heard, and we don't know what the outcome of those will be. Of course, it may well be that whatever the planning inspector decides, that those appeal decisions get appealed onwards, as it were, up to the planning court and beyond. So it's really an unknown at the moment, unfortunately. I do know from personal experience that the planning inspectorate are dealing with quite a backlog of appeal decisions due to the COVID-19 situation and the need to implement virtual inquiries as well. So there is quite a backlog of those to be dealing with. So it may well be that actually these two airport decisions aren't decided in time to assist this panel when it comes to deliberate at Leeds Bradford, unfortunately.
So what you're saying is that was a decision made by their planning committees in their opinions. So if we were to do the same, we could do the same, really.
Yeah, I mean it's open to this panel to make the decisions. What I can't do is offer you any sort of insight at all as to how such a decision would be treated by the planning inspector or the courts, because we haven't got anything concrete at that stage. So I wouldn't be able to say, well, if you make this decision, we can look at Bristol and we can look at Stansted, and this is what was ultimately decided in that situation, because it's too premature to do so. But in principle, this panel can make that decision.
Okay, fair enough.
Thank you, Matt.
I've got another question.
Okay. Thanks, Matt.
And it's
can
on
I
the
just,
economic...
Can I just say...
sorry.
I've just said to Matt, thank you. That was very clear to members. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I found that useful. On the economic projections, what economic situation was those projections done on? Are we talking on the basis of how it was 6 months ago, or how it is likely to be in 6 months' time? Bearing in mind that we are now in an entirely different world to what we were 6 months ago.
Thank you. Carol, do you want to start that one off?
Yeah, I can do. I mean, the original environmental statement was based on predictions that were pre-COVID. We went back to the airport and asked them to assess the impact of COVID on the airline industry. And they submitted a supplementary environmental statement in end of July, early August. And I think what that's shown is that their economic projections are the same as what they were pre-COVID. There is a 2-year delay. So ultimately, when they get to 2030, they will be in the same economic situation as they would have been pre-COVID. It will just take 2 years from the airport being open for them to start to get to the levels that they expected to be before. We have had a economic assessment submitted by Galba disputing this. Now, this has only just been recently received, as I said at the beginning of my presentation, and we need to look at it and look what they're saying and why they disagree with what the predictions are that the airport have come up with. And when we come back to you with the final report, we'll have more information on that for you.
Okay, is that okay, David? You're muted.
That's okay. And a final question, and this is about the extended hours. Looking through the report, the only justification I can see for extending the hours is that Newcastle have got longer hours, Birmingham's got longer hours, other places have got other hours. And as far as I'm concerned, we're dealing with Leeds. What is the main motivation behind this to get more aircraft taken off?
Okay, David. David, I could see that you wanted to come in. Perhaps you could deal with the last question or your comments you wanted to make regarding that, and the next question about the justification is just simply local airports.
Sorry, Chair, I lost connection for a few minutes, and I've just come back in. I just got the end of Councillor Blackburn's comment about Newcastle. I think it was probably a question for the airport, but the actual application, I think, sets out the intention. I think the applicants have made comparisons with other regional airports, and I think the points that have been made basically say that at the moment Leeds Bradford Airport isn't reaching its potential when compared to other regional airports. I think that's the context for it, and linked to that is how does the Leeds Bradford Airport sit within the local economic and transport context within our part of the world. So I don't know if colleagues from the airport wanted to make any points of clarification there, Chair.
Thanks, David. I did bring you in because I saw you wanted to speak on the first question. So yes, I will bring this in, Mr. Reeves, and of course all that is contained within the report anyway. Mr. Reeves, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I think the answer to the question is that the airlines that operate from Leeds Bradford cannot operate efficiently unless they can start at that time of the morning. So in order to operate aircraft efficiently and recover the economic cost of those aircraft and the cost of running them, they need to begin in the early morning. And a typical airline will do 6 to 8 rotations, that is 6 to 8 journeys every day. And if they can't operate sufficiently early in the morning, then they're not able to do that. And what that means is that they will tend to gravitate to airports that do allow them to be more efficient, to have a more efficient operation. And that's been one of the key constraints on the ability of Leeds Bradford Airport to develop in the past. Tim may have something to add to that.
Sorry, Chair, yes, thank you very much. And I think it's probably just in answer to Mr. Blackburn's question about is it simply, and I'm just paraphrasing, is it simply because others have got the same kind of restriction or got more lenient restrictions that the airport should be allowed? It isn't that simple, Chair. It's presented in the environmental impact assessment and the planning submission what the impacts of this proposal are specifically in this area. So it's a bespoke assessment which we've undertaken, which demonstrates that the level of effects, both in terms of noise and carbon and all other environmental effects, are at levels that are appropriate in Leeds at this particular site. So whilst we may cite, or there may have been cited, other particular airports which have got more lenient controls, they are specific to those particular airports, but we have demonstrated that in this particular case, the mitigation that we're proposing, this isn't a case that we're simply removing mitigation. We are actually reimposing new mitigation that is more modern and that addresses the impacts in this particular case to a level that is deemed acceptable and appropriate by your technical advisors.
Thanks, Tim. Moving on to comments then, and surprise, surprise, Councillor Blackburn, you're first up for a comment, and we're going back in the alphabetical order.
Oh dear, back on again. Anyway, yeah. Right. Well, quite clearly, I'll more be bemused after all these questions have been answered than prior to it. I mean, if we can't take into consideration the flights coming in and out, basically, we might as well not have a climate emergency. Because the fact is, a 70-odd% increase in passenger numbers is going to produce more pollution. I think it was, what was it now? The UK Committee on Climate Change said growth to a maximum of 25%. Well, this is 70-odd%. And the thing is, it isn't, I do not believe it's about taking passengers from Manchester or London or wherever. I believe what it is, it's the industry, because everybody's trying to expand. It's the industry trying to expand the number of flights. And as a nation or as a world, we can't afford to allow more flights. We need to reduce them, not increase them. So I say I'm not being happy about a lot of answers that we've got there, and I want some clarity about how far we can go. Certainly, other authorities have turned things down on that basis. The other thing about the hours, as I said, as when I was just questioning there, the fact is these hours were given for a reason, and I totally believe that they should remain. I can't see any good reason for doing it. It's about operational matters. Well, no, this is about a planning matter. This is about noise for residents, and I cannot see any reason at all for that. I'll keep my comments as that, but I think you can see where I'm coming from.
Okay, thank you, David. Councillor Kaylee Brooks, please. Kaylee.
Yeah, I've got really no further comments. I think, well, yeah, no further comments.
Thank you, Kaylee. Moving on, Councillor Campbell, are you still here?
Yes, I'm just still there.
Oh, well done. Good.
I've got a number of comments basically around the questions we're going to be asked. So if we look at highways and transportation, it's clear, isn't it, that there will be an increase in surface traffic within the airport, taking people to the airport. I don't think there's enough mitigation measures to effectively neutralise that. I've already raised the issue of the 1 hour free parking from a local ward member's point of view, because the people who live in my area have to put up with the people on the street. I would strongly oppose that, and that's not prejudging the application, Chair. I am somewhat concerned that the highways works, even if we can't make any comment whatsoever about the aircraft. And I suppose the information I got was effectively it's air flights. I'm just wondering if we are allowed to comment on the pollution caused by aircraft taxiing, which is an interesting question for somebody later on. I am concerned that we're going to increase the amount of pollution in the Leeds district. We seem to be relying on other people being good to deal with an increase here, when I believe that everybody should be making an effort to reduce their pollution or their carbon footprint. The airport isn't really mitigating it at the moment, and I'm sure there are things they could do. And in particular, the new terminal, and we're all happy with the new terminal being carbon neutral, but we've still got the old terminal. So if you don't demolish the old terminal as part of this application, then actually the carbon footprint of the airport goes up rather than down. We talk about a lot of things which I think are really difficult to measure, aren't they? So we talk about aircraft noise, we talk about vehicle movements, and we get phrases like it's minimal, or it's a minor increase, or it's not too much trouble for the network. But these are significant numbers of vehicle movements and aircraft movements which create noise. Noise is relative. So to say that a modern aircraft is quieter than an old one is true. But as I often say, people don't wake up in the middle of the night when a plane goes over and say to themselves, my, that's a nice quiet aeroplane. So it's relative, and it's the amount of noise that we're in totality, I think. So what we're actually saying is the amount of noise that the airport will produce will increase, and there will be significantly more at night, which I'm really have some concerns about. If I just, I think we're asked a question about regarding air quality, and it seems to me that it's obvious that air quality will deteriorate. And we say about a negligible effect. Well, I cannot believe that all those, at least 1.5 million extra vehicle movements to the airport will not produce more than a negligible effect. And again, that's about mitigation. If you just bear with me, because I'm dying to go through quickly. I've talked about the noise. Again, we go back to this issue, and I think David touched on it really, didn't it? Which is the nighttime flying is a major issue locally. I think it's the second most spoken about problem after the pollution levels. I think I am unsure why we should increase the number of flights during what would be a reduced nighttime period, and haven't really been persuaded by the airport or by this report. I think, Chair, if you just I think the rest of it's probably going to be something that we do at the when the application comes back. I think I've had a couple of comments about the design, landscaping. Quite frankly, there isn't enough landscaping. It's very clear that this, though it's an interesting building, and appears to be quite well designed, it will be very prominent within the landscape, and so there could be a lot more mitigation, I think, put in place to deal with that. And I think our conservation people are not happy with the details of the ecology and biodiversity programme. So can I leave it at that, Chair?
That's fine, Colin. Thank you for those comments. Councillor Peter Carlisle, please. Peter.
Thank you, Chair. I'll keep mine reasonably brief because I know I had a lot of the questions, but I think the one thing I'll say really, I'm thinking about when this comes back, and I think thank you for all the complicated legal answers around there, because I think that has provided very valuable advice to assist certainly in my deliberations, and I'm sure other members. But I think the one then concern I have of the detail of the report we've got and the questions I'll have that go unanswered is that given a number of those matters of the national climate change targets and the Paris Agreement are Mr. Hill's, I think's words were cannot say it's immaterial. So immaterial considerations in this, I think I will really need more detail in that, because when we get beyond what we've got in the report about the local climate change targets, there's really little detail in whether we can say any decision we make today renders any of those acts difficult to meet those targets. Therefore, I think we'll need more detail around that. I mean, one thing that I have that's just a point of comment and a real concern to me in the report is if we look at 10.23, for instance, which talks about our Leeds climate goal, not the national ones, it does state that it's not possible to conclude whether the increase will prevent our Leeds goal, and similar in the next paragraph is said about the national one, but it will require equivalent reductions to make up for it from other sectors or sources. I mean, from the work I've seen in Leeds and at West Yorkshire and at national level, and I think probably around the world. Really, those targets that have been set because they are the quickest we can feasibly get when everyone plays all efforts they can in order to tackle the emergency of climate change. I think I do take somewhat of an affront at the report suggesting that it's possible that if the airport contributes more than we expect, that somebody else will be able to reduce theirs further, because really I think it's quite clear that everyone needs to play their part in going as far as they can, and that really is the ambition of this council and hopefully of wider areas in that. So I think I'll leave it at that. I'd like to see some more detail as that in the report when it comes back. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Moving on, Councillor Dan Combe, please.
Thank you, Chair. In many ways, I've found today really interesting. In fact, in lots of ways, I found today really interesting. Not least, it's the first time I've actually sat on a panel where it really seems many colleagues are finding more and more reasons why they will be able to refuse something that's ultimately going to be a major driver for economic prosperity in the city. I still, I have to be honest, have a very much open mind. I share many of the concerns around emissions and climate change that colleagues have raised, but I think there's a balance on whether we actually want to deliver 12,000 plus new jobs and what weight we need to give to certain elements of the emissions that are undoubtedly going to be generated. I think Councillor Walshaw actually kicked off for me with probably, I think, the most important bit of information we need. Councillor Carlow also referred to it. I think we need some unequivocal QC advice as to where the domestic and international emissions lay. Because what we were told is undoubtedly true. We can make any decision we like. We are a panel of elected members. We can make any decision we like. I always used to say to clients, you can, look, I'll advise you, you can make any decision you like. But actually, that doesn't mean that you're not going to make a legally bad decision. We can make a decision that's a legally poor decision that will get overturned at appeal, and the city will be hit with the costs because we've not followed a sensible legal position, which is why what Councillor Walshaw said is exactly right. Should we be considering, as part of this application, the emissions that will come from local, domestic and international flights? Because if we should be, if that is something we ought to be giving significant weight to, I think this is a very problematic application, and I can see that. But if they are not things that we should be giving significant weight to, then I think the positives, it would seem there seem to be significant positives in this application that would need very serious consideration. I think that is going to be one of the key determinants, for me at least, on where this ends up in terms of a decision. I think we've got to be careful not to misdirect ourselves once we've got that legal advice, however much we might want to, because all that will happen is we will be overturned at appeal. We will pay significant legal costs for the privilege. And frankly, we may run the risk of looking somewhat incompetent as a panel if we've not followed very clear legal advice. So as I say, I think that's really important. We get that high level legal advice that is unequivocal, and legal advice can be unequivocal. I know because I used to give it. I also think we need to disabuse ourselves of the notion that if this doesn't go ahead, that people aren't going to go to Manchester or elsewhere. They are. people are going to fly. I think it's I understand the proposition, as Councillor Walshaw said, well, people might think better of it. Well, in which case there's no danger in giving this the go ahead, because people will think better of it and they won't use the flights. But people are going to fly. Businesses will want to travel. And therefore, if it's not available locally, they'll travel further to make those journeys. So I think the only outcome there is that Manchester does very nicely out of this. I'm surprised they've not put a more robust objection in. I think there is a huge amount of work still to do here. I believe that Leeds as a dynamic, vibrant city should have a world-class airport. I've heard nothing today that persuades me other than that should be one of our ambitions. And I will look forward to seeing many of the challenges and questions we've asked today be addressed in somewhat more detail. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Dan. Moving on then, Councillor Al Garthwaite, please. Al?
Yes, I think that we have to focus on Leeds, not the whole country, in our decision making. We're not responsible, we cannot be responsible for what happens elsewhere. We have to think just about Leeds and our obligations to Leeds. And that's where I'm going to be making my decisions. I think that much of what I think has been said so far. I would say that when you look at diversity, we only have to look at the favourable effect of lockdown on diversity. Fewer planes and cars mean more biodiversity. That's just how it is. Having said that, we have to balance up the other advantages of those forms of transport. In terms of economic benefits, I think we have to weigh them up against the health, environment and social effects. And that's what I shall be seeking to do when I look at the report that comes to us next, with all the answers to the questions that we've asked today. Thank you.
Thank you, Al. Councillor Hamilton.
I have no comments to make, Chair. Everybody said quite a few things that I've listened to, so I don't think I should make any comments today.
Thank you, Sharon. Councillor Latty.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I must confess that I found myself sitting here listening to my colleague, Councillor Cohen, and silently cheering him on. It can't just be political, but he and I are obviously very, very much of a mind here. I do think that this afternoon there's been a feeling of sort of self-indulgence about the way the questions have been going. And certainly it sounded to me as though everything was predicated on turning this thing down. But I think what we haven't focused on this afternoon is one, oh no, not what we haven't focused on, but nobody has mentioned the benefits to Leeds as a city of having an airport that people, when they land there or go there to go somewhere else, aren't looking at what is, in spite of the business it does at the moment, a pretty run-down, old-fashioned, inconvenient airport. We want Leeds to be a major European city still, and that means attracting people here and getting people to go out from here. The airport would be a major factor within this. Also locally, the benefits to the local economy of the airport are considerable, and that if we have a better airport, in theory, they should be better. Certainly the job creation that it would bring, not only during the building, but afterwards when we have, or if we have I should say, from the sound of the comments today, a major new airport building with greatly improved aircraft flying from it. I think that to me is a vision. And what today we've been looking at has been into the abyss rather than looking up. And I would much prefer to look up. And I think that a little bit more openness of mind might well be called for. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sorry, I've muted myself there. Thank you, Graham. Moving on, Councillor Nash, please.
Well, I think councillors are between a rock and a hard place. Clearly, we are all concerned about the environment, and we are under pressure from virtually all our members of parliament and other people to turn down this application. But there's no doubt in my mind that if for whatever reason in the end we do turn down the application, there will be an appeal to the Secretary of State and it will be granted. So I think we have to make the best of what we possibly can over the development of the airport. I did mention before when we had a meeting, I am particularly concerned about all those people travelling by car to Manchester and they are driving through my ward. Why should my constituents put up with a load of vehicles coming through the ward to access the M621? It's just not on. And I hear what my colleague said about we have to be concerned about Leeds people. Well, I'm concerned about Leeds people. I'm concerned about my own residents. I did wonder whether perhaps I ought to have declared an interest in that. I'm a tour leader and I have been doing it for 40 years. But apart from twice, all my group tours have been by coach. But we haven't got the ferries to Scandinavia, which is a route if one is traveling to Russia. I've traveled to Russia twice, the Baltic states twice, Norway 4 times, which includes Sweden at the same time. You can't do it now. It would take you a week to get there. The only other time I've flown is to Prague, and I have taken coaches there to Prague 4 times. The last time was flying. You arrive there in a couple of hours, whereas it takes a couple of days by coach. I would dearly love there to be an efficient, cheap train system in our country, as well as the ferries abroad, but we haven't got it. And the last time when I did fly to Norway, that was only the second time, we did travel by train to the airport. The train was late and there was anxiety. And I'm thinking, am I going to be ruined if I don't get there, a group there at the check-in time? It did work out in the end, but it's a pressure which no one should have. I notice all the questions that were being asked. I think in a way it is a bit premature because it implies one has made up one's mind. This is a position statement and I think we've all taken notice of it. And I would like to take my decision when the final application comes up before the panel. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Liz. Yes, I've been looking at the questions and I think most of them we've answered somewhere in today's meeting, but I'll be duty bound to put them to you anyway. Councillor Reagan, please.
No comments, Chair.
Thank you, Denise. Councillor Wadsworth, please.
Gosh, you got to me.
Yeah.
Right. I will be brief because no doubt Councillor Walshaw will not be brief. So we've got that to come, no doubt, because he had a lot of questions and he'll have a lot of comments. Just regarding changing the world, when I came on council, I wanted to change the world, all for the better. And a number of years, I'd like to forget how many years I've been on council. I'm still here and I haven't changed much of the world. So I think the world and travel is not something that this council can deal with. Nor the airport, I have to say. They are certainly reliant on the technology that's available at the time. And the present situation is putting technology back, not bringing it forward. And I think as Councillor Campbell spoke about relative noise, noise is relative. And sitting here, I think I've heard one plane take off all afternoon. That's what relative noise looks like. And during lockdown, obviously there were no planes taking off or landing. And so there was no noise whatsoever. So if we want to reduce down to zero noise, lockdown is where we need to be. I do think we have to work with the airport over noise. I don't believe that the airport really want to fly 24 hours a day, bobbing in and bobbing out just when they're pleased. I believe really the airport want an earlier hour to start up in the morning so that they can get the rotations in for the airlines. And during last summer, they did do landings quite deep into the night. And I think we need to work with them as to whether we can eradicate some of that late night, early hours of the morning landings, which I have to say do penalise the Headingley and Hyde Park areas, because that's normally the rotation if there's no wind in the summer that they're coming in. The takeoffs are normally out over the north part of the city and out over the moors. So I think that's really where we need to work. With regards to the 1 hour free parking, Howell will know that I will fight him all the way with that, because that is about, you need smile, that is about being a good neighbour. The biggest users of that are the people in my ward and in Councillor Campbell's ward, because it's about not wanting to pay the £3 charge, the frequent flyers in general who want to go for business, and our local taxi firms that are having to pay £3 or £6 in some cases if they've got to go through twice for what is probably only a £5 taxi ride, and that's not sustainable. But the 1 hour free parking does allow for that. I think we'd all like to travel by ship. I think, was it Councillor Nash that likes to travel by ship? But you want to see what ship's fuel is like. It's like tar, Councillor Nash. So I'm sure you wouldn't want that getting into the atmosphere. And with regarding the building replacement, I don't think we would have these comments if it was about replacing a school. A school in my ward is currently being replaced and it's never been to plans panel. And so we are looking at replacing an old building that is leaking everything, sometimes outward and sometimes inward when it rains, with something of BREEAM quality. And I'm sure we all support the actual replacement of the building if we actually look at it. There's been some questions asked about its size, etc. But I do think we need to make some progress with this application and get it sorted one way or the other. We may well be, Councillor Nash, between a rock and a hard place, but we need to make the decision rather than be just sitting between those two rocks. And so I think with that, Councillor Latty's point was a very good one, that we should have more openness of mind rather than blinkers when looking at this application. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, moving on. Finally, Councillor Walshaw, please. Neil?
Thanks, Chair. That was the brief version from Councillor Walshaw. Well, it's been an extremely useful position statement, Chair, and I think there's been a lot of important issues raised by colleagues and myself. I just think it's clear that there's a, if you like, a diversity of opinion onto what weight members will put on different aspects of this application, and I think that's right and proper. That's the way it is, and we've just been really, I think, this afternoon trying to tease out to make sure that we have all the information in front of us to what it is to make a very important decision when this comes forward for determination. So, I mean, there is an awful lot we can say. I think we've covered it in, I won't say that, Chair. I won't go into a huge essay, don't worry. But clearly we've made it clear to officers and the applicant the breadth and depth of the information we need, the further legal opinion we need, and all that. And I will actually just leave it at that, because this is just a position statement after all. But I think there are some enormous, serious legal and strategic hurdles that this application has to cross for us to come to a position and to a determination. I look forward to that coming forward, Chair. Thank you.
Thanks, Neil. That was short. And it's appreciated. It's been a long day, but I guess that's the reason why I agreed just to have this one item on the agenda. You know, I knew this would be a long one. It's difficult time for members, and they have to carefully consider everything, which I think they are doing. In asking Dalgid to sum up, can I guide you towards section 11 with the 9 questions? Do you feel it's important that we put these questions to members? I think most of these questions have been answered as we've gone on during the day. Over to you, Dalgid.
Thank you, Chair. No, I don't think, bearing in mind how the debate and has gone and how the afternoon has gone, I don't think it's necessary to put those questions. We members have made their comments quite clear, and we do record these meetings now, so those will be captured in full detail. And I think it's incumbent upon officers and the applicant to work through the comments that have been raised and to make sure that we prepare appropriate replies when we come back to you for determination. I've just made a bullet point list of some of the issues that have been raised, but as I said, there may well have been other comments that are recorded and we will go through. But clearly, panel is seeking clear, unequivocal guidance on whether local and national flight carbon emissions can be taken into account, and how much weight to put to local and national guidance in that respect. There was also comments raised about the implications of the carbon emissions relating to the development in terms of the Leeds target to achieve zero carbon emissions by 2030. There was questions raised about the impact of the development on road traffic, particularly the use of electric vehicles as we go forward, and the contributions towards public transport measures, including the proposed railway station. There were questions about connectivity and routes between the proposed station, the employment hub and the airport. There was questions and discussion around the impact of the aircraft on noise and the implications of that in terms of local and national guidance. There was also a discussion around the economic impact of the development and the benefits that would bring to the area. And then there was technical questions around how the clawback of potential trade from other airports was looked at and being considered. There were perhaps more limited consideration of the design of the new terminal building, although there were some questions about the layout of that and the matters in the report about landscaping. But I think it's clear that where members' focus was, and we will pick those up when we come back to panel. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Dalgid. Yes, the report is only a position statement, and members were being asked the questions, which I think they've answered and provided comments, which was needed. And I thank you for that. Can I thank all who's attended, and certainly Mr. Rees and Mr. Waring from Leeds and Bradford Airport, who provided us with interesting technical assistance. I would hope that we have a bit more next time around, because these questions are important and need answers for members to make the decisions they need to make. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking, but again, thank you all. It's been very interesting, and I'm sure people who have plugged in on YouTube, on the web, will have found it very interesting. I certainly have, just sat here in the chair listening to you all speak. So with that, I will close the meeting. Just remind you, we have another planning meeting on the 1st of October. City Plans panel, I'm afraid, is very busy, but thank you again. And John, if you can close down the